Theon Greyjoy stood on the battlements of Moat Cailin, the damp wind off the swamps tugging at his cloak. He was only 19 years of age, and while he carried himself with the swagger of a man confident in his identity, his true sense of self had never felt so precarious. Memories of his childhood crashed against his conscience, pounding at the inside of his skull. He was the boy who had been taken from Pike at 10, brought to Winterfell as a ward, although hostage was the truer word after his father's failed rebellion. Yet amid the stone walls of Winterfell, the chill northern air, and the companionship of the Stark children, Theon had found a strange, unexpected kind of belonging. Ned Stark was more of a father than Balon Greyjoy had ever been, and though Theon would never voice it aloud, he felt more a son of Winterfell than a prince of Pike. But the tides of war had changed everything. Robb Stark needed men and ships. Theon had been dispatched to the Iron Islands to forge an alliance with his estranged father in hopes that Balon Greyjoy might join Robb's cause against the Iron Throne. For days, Theon had wrestled with his loyalties. Returning to Pike, he had recognized only the battered shells of his childhood memories, brittle and scattered. His father was distant, laconic, and cold as the stony beaches that encircled his fortress. Balon looked upon Theon as a disappointment, a youth tainted by years among the Greenlanders, a boy who had been, in Balon's eyes, an enemy captive. Balon had expected unconditional loyalty, had demanded that Theon prove his Iron-born heritage. The solution presented to Theon was simple and callous: seize the north while Robb Stark was waging war against the Lannisters in the south. It was the way of the Ironborn: reave, raid, take what others would not freely give. In Balon's mind, Theon was more than capable of leading the assault. His familiarity with the North would pave an easy path to victory. The choice Balon demanded was Stark: prove himself a true son of Pike by turning on the Starks, or remain shackled as a false Ironborn, a kraken on a direwolf's leash. Every fiber of Theon's being had shrieked at the betrayal. He had stood before Balon in the great hall of Pike, the torches crackling in the damp air. Yara, his sister, had watched him with narrowing eyes, appraising whether he was weak or cunning, brother or southerner. The salt tang that perfumed the castle corridors reminded him of the sea, of his birthright. Yet the memory of Winterfell's soaring towers reminded him of warmth, the loyal faces of Robb and Jon, the trust in Ned Stark's eyes. These had become the truths that shaped him. For hours that night, Theon had paced the cold floors of his old bedchamber, hearing the echoes of distant waves pounding the rocks below. Eddard Stark had raised him, perhaps not as a son but as something more than a common ward. Robb Stark had called Theon brother, shared stories with him by the hearth in Winterfell's great hall, and placed absolute faith in him. Could Theon betray that? When morning arrived, Theon accompanied his father down to the courtyard. Balon offered him command of the sea bitch with a small fleet, insisting it was time Theon led a strike deep into the north, into the heart of that once familiar land. Theon remembered the thrust of Balon's final words: show the Starks how sharp the iron is. Theon felt a chill seize him, though it had little to do with the cold wind off the sea. What life would he have if he defied the father he'd only just been reacquainted with? Was the price for acceptance in Pike truly the blood of his dearest friend? He longed to live up to the ideals of an Ironborn, to carve out his own glory. And yet, a vow deeper than blood pulled him away from that path. He recalled the old ways of House Stark, the code of honor in the north. Sometimes at night, he could still hear Ned Stark telling his own sons that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. A man should face the consequences of his choices. Theon felt a pang, something that reminded him of regret, but also something that might have been pride. On that fateful morning, instead of giving Balon his dutiful acceptance, Theon kept his hands clasped behind his back and let his gaze flick to the restless sea. It was time to speak. His voice was tight, but each word felt earned by the conflict in his gut. "My lord father," he said, forcing himself to look Balon in the eyes. "I cannot march on Winterfell. I will not take arms against the Starks." In the hush that followed, he heard his heart thunder in his ears as though it might burst from his chest. Nearby, Yara's expression turned thunderous. Balon's eyes narrowed into slits. "You will do as I command," he said, each word chiseled from stone. "Theon, I offer you a crown if you only have the spine to claim it. Bring the north to heel, and you stand as a prince of Pike. All the spoils of war, glory, gold, blood, shall be ours. This is your birthright." Theon felt the weight of that moment as a pivot to the rest of his life. If he yielded, if he agreed to Balon's plan, the proud lord of the Iron Islands might accept him as a true heir. But he would rend asunder every tie he had formed in the north. He would sacrifice the memory of Ned Stark's quiet counsel, Robb's unwavering friendship, the easy laughter shared with the rest of the Stark children. He would become a usurper, a rapacious reaver, a man with nothing but the iron price to define him. In that clash of loyalties, Theon heard his own voice speak almost as though it came from some deeper place inside him that had already chosen. I won't, Theon repeated. I am loyal to House Stark as they have been good to me. Yara spat on the floor at Theon's feet. So you are no Ironborn. The Starks have made you a wolf pup and now you cower at our father's commands. Balon's nostrils flared. For a moment, Theon thought the man might strike him. Instead, Balon's voice was cold and almost regretful. Then you are no son of mine, he said. Begone. The next time we meet, it will not be his family. The silence that followed was worse than any blow. Theon's mind whirled with the finality of that severed tie. He turned on his heel, half expecting a blade in his back. But he felt only the dispassionate stares of guards and the stinging judgment of his sister as he walked away. His old life on Pike was gone if it had ever existed. He rode for days through the rugged, salt-scarred lands of the Iron Islands, making his way to the small quay where a single ship, a battered merchant cog, was all he could secure to cross back to the mainland. The crew was sullen, suspicious of his claims to be a Greyjoy. Their scorn was plain, but Theon paid them with what coin he'd managed to salvage, ignoring the scowls and barbs thrown his way. Let them sneer, he thought. He had made his choice. If he died in a storm, so be it. But if he lived, he would stand by Robb Stark. No matter the personal cost. The sea crossing was grim. Endless gray skies leered overhead and the waters heaved like a restless beast. Theon spent long hours huddled in a corner of the deck, ignoring the spray of salt on his face. His thoughts were consumed by what he might say to Robb, how he might explain himself. Shame warred with resolve. He had gone to Pike hoping to raise the Iron Islands in support of the North. Instead, he was returning empty-handed. Perhaps worse, he might have roused Balon to action against Robb. There was every possibility that Balon would still attempt to seize the North, except now Theon was anathema to them, a traitor to both sides. Wounded pride stung him, yet overshadowed by a deeper sense of belonging. The North was his home, and if the Iron Islands came raiding, he would fight them. The battered cog landed him in the neck, near a lonely stretch of shoreline where few souls passed. Paying the captain one final time, Theon trudged onward, cloak heavy with sea spray. At night, he slept fitfully beneath outcroppings of rock or in the occasional wayside inn, always glancing over his shoulder for Ironborn reavers who might shadow him. But the days passed without incident, and eventually the soggy marshland gave way to firmer earth. Theon pressed north, Moat Cailin looming on the horizon. When he reached the ruined fortress, he found it lightly guarded by men sworn to Robb Stark. At first, the guards were alarmed to see a Greyjoy bannerless, on foot, approaching. Arrows were notched. But Theon raised his hands in the damp wind and called, I come for the king in the north. I bring word from Pike, and I mean no harm. The tension was thick, but eventually one of the guards recognized him from his days riding at Robb's side. They led him inside with caution, though they did not tie his hands. It was an improvement over the welcome he might have received if rumors of the Ironborn threat had already taken root. Moat Cailin was half-ruined, but it was a strategic point that Robb had left garrisoned to keep an eye on the approach from the south. Rumors of Lannister forces had grown, but no large army had marched this far north. Theon was greeted by a senior officer who listened with stony silence as Theon explained his mission's failure, how Balon had refused the alliance, how he might even plan to march against the north. The man eyed Theon with suspicion. You abandoned your father? Theon's throat felt tight. He demanded that I strike against the Starks. I refused. The older soldier scanned Theon for any sign of deception. For the moment, he said, you are free to remain here. But we'll send a rider to the king in the north, informing him of your arrival. Robb Stark will decide your fate. That night, Theon slept in a cramped corner of the fortress, the walls thick with moss and a musty dampness pervading every corridor. He dreamt of a wolf and a kraken locked in struggle. The wolf howled, the kraken's tentacles battered. When Theon awoke in a cold sweat, he realized he was shivering, though from fear or the chill of the stone keep, he could not be certain. Days later, a column of riders arrived, a portion of Robb's host traveling north. Ser Rodrik Castle was among them, his familiar face framed by those snowy side whiskers, though his expression was cautious. They brought word that Robb was en route to the Twins for a possible alliance with Walder Frey. Theon's presence was requested. Or, perhaps more accurately, demanded. If the king in the north saw fit to question his old friend, it would be on ground of his own choosing. And so Theon set out with Ser Rodrik's men, heading south to meet Robb Stark on his way north, a strange tangle of marches and countermarches. As they rode, Theon felt the old northern camaraderie stirring in him, the deep sense of shared burdens. He remembered days hunting with Robb, nights at feasts, all the small moments of closeness forged by living under the same roof for so many years. He also remembered how, in quieter moments, he'd envied Robb's birthright, the unwavering acceptance and love that surrounded the Stark heir. A swirl of emotion tightened in Theon's chest. He had thrown away the acceptance of House Greyjoy for a chance at loyalty to the Starks. He prayed it was not too late. Finally, under a cold drizzle that turned the roads to mud, they reached Robb's camp. Tents dotted the field, the banners of the wolf flapping in a biting wind. Theon felt tension in his limbs as he dismounted, vaguely aware that many eyes were on him. Former comrade or potential threat? He saw fear, disdain, and some glimmers of recognition. He was guided into a larger tent at the center of the encampment. There, by the light of torches and braziers, stood Robb Stark, the king in the north, mail gleaming beneath a heavy cloak. Grey Wind, his dire wolf, prowled at his side, hackles raised. The beast's yellow eyes were fixed on Theon, lips drawn back enough to display a flash of fangs. Theon dropped to one knee. "Your Grace," he said, voice trembling despite his attempt at composure. Robb's voice was quiet. "Stand, Theon." His gaze flicked to Grey Wind, a silent command. The dire wolf stopped growling but did not approach. Rising slowly, Theon forced himself to meet Robb's eyes. When had his friend grown so hardened? The face was Robb's, the same thick auburn hair, the same strong jaw, but there was a weight behind his eyes that had not been there before the war. "Robb," Theon began, and then corrected himself, "my king. I failed you. Balon Greyjoy will not ally with the North. He demanded I betray you, that I lead the Ironborn in an attack on Winterfell. I refused him." Robb's stare was unreadable. "Why?" Theon swallowed. "Because the Starks have been my family more than my own ever was." Grey Wind padded closer, sniffing around Theon as though to weigh the sincerity of his words. Theon kept as still as possible, remembering how the dire wolves could sense fear or falsehood in ways no man could. "I cannot speak for the Ironborn," Theon continued, "but I suspect they may attack, with or without me. My father wants to claim the North for himself." A murmur spread through the assembled lords. Roose Bolton stood not far from Robb, expression grim, while Great Jon Umber appeared angrier by the moment. Theon felt his stomach roil, suspecting each of these men might be measuring him against their sharpened blades. Robb's posture relaxed a fraction, but only a fraction. "Did you give them any information about our troop movements or our plans?" he asked, direct as a blade thrust. Theon shook his head vehemently. "No. I refused him outright. I left Pike with barely more than the clothes on my back. My father disowned me." Theon let bitterness bleed into his tone. "I am not one of them. Not anymore." Slowly Robb nodded. The torchlight flickered, casting uncertain shadows. After a long pause, he spoke. "I'll accept your word on one condition." He drew a short dagger from his belt, its steel glinting in the light. "Swear your loyalty anew to House Stark. Not as hostage, not as ward, but as Theon Greyjoy who freely gives his oath to me. Place your hand upon my sword and swear fealty." Theon's mouth felt dry. This was the moment of truth. He stepped forward, removing his glove. He placed his hand atop the flat of the blade Robb held out. The cold metal bit at his skin. His voice trembled, but it was clear. "I, Theon Greyjoy, do swear by the old gods and the new, my life and service to Robb Stark, the king in the North. May I be killed if I forsake this oath." For a heartbeat, Theon felt the weight of countless gazes upon him. Then Robb slid the dagger back into its sheath. He extended his hand, resting it briefly on Theon's shoulder. "Rise, then, Theon Greyjoy of the North." Theon felt relief cascade through him, warring with the sting of tears at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away. The king in the North gave a subtle nod, as if acknowledging that Theon's presence was welcome but hardly free of complexities. There were still others to convince, still questions about how the Iron Islands would respond to Balon's will. But for now, Theon Greyjoy was not cast out. He was among friends, brothers, in a way. That same night, Theon ate at the king's table, though the mood was subdued. The war was going poorly in some quarters. The Lannisters still held King's Landing, and Stannis Baratheon had declared his own claim to the Iron Throne. The North was far from safe. While men feasted on salt beef and hard bread, the tension in the tent was palpable. Theon spoke little, feeling the stares. Roose Bolton sat across from him, expression as unreadable as winter ice. The Grey Jon asked 2 or 3 times about Ironborn cunning, each question edged with suspicion, but Robb's presence kept the man's loudest threats in check. Later, Robb invited Theon to speak privately. They left the tent, letting the chill night air steal the warmth from their cheeks. Grey Wind followed them at a slight distance, vigilant as always. There was a small brazier outside, the sparks dancing in the breeze. Robb turned to Theon, crossing his arms. Are you certain Balon will strike? Will the Ironborn risk open war with the North while we're engaged against the Lannisters? Theon exhaled. Balon has never been one to bow. If he sees weakness, he will seize the opportunity to carve out a kingdom. I fear he means to strike swiftly while your armies are far from home. Bear in mind, he doesn't need a massive host to cause havoc. The Ironborn excel at quick raids. By the time news travels, they could have burned half the coast. Robb was silent for a moment, lips set in a grim line. If that's true, Winterfell is vulnerable. Bran, Rickon, my mother left for Riverrun, but my brothers are there. I can't leave them defenseless. Theon felt a weight in his gut. He had once joked with Robb about the younger Stark boys, teased them with the carefree arrogance of youth. Now he realized how slender the margin for safety truly was. Let me go, Theon said, surprising even himself. Let me help guard Winterfell. If the Ironborn come, I can be there to rally the defenses. Robb's eyebrows rose slightly. You do that? Yes. Theon lifted his chin, trying to project confidence. I know their tactics, their mindset. If I'm at Winterfell, I can help prepare a defense. Your brothers would be safer. Robb studied Theon's face. People will question your motives, he said quietly. But I believe you. And there's no one more suited to anticipate Balon's moves than someone who's been raised among them. I'll send men with you, but I can't spare many. Every sword is precious in this war. Theon nodded resolutely. A small garrison might be enough. If we fortify the walls, if we close off the approach, we can hold out until reinforcements arrive. Winterfell is not easily taken, especially if the defenders expect an attack. Robb placed a hand on Theon's shoulder again. I trust you. There was an unspoken subtext. Don't make me regret this. Theon bowed his head. I will not fail you, Robb. Within days, Theon set off north for Winterfell, accompanied by a modest band of Northmen, their loyalty sworn to House Stark. Among them were some seasoned fighters, a few from House Serwyn, one from House Tallheart, and a handful of archers. The great Jon grudgingly assigned 24 men, though he muttered that every one of them would have an eye on Theon at all times. Theon accepted that without complaint. It was sensible. Trust was earned. They took the King's Road, its ancient paving stones slick with early frost. The journey was a grim reminder of how vast and empty the North could feel. They passed through wooded stretches haunted by nothing more than ravens, occasionally fording rivers that ran cold and dark. At night, they huddled around small fires, carefully rationing their provisions. Tension lingered among the men, but Theon strove to prove himself. He kept watch when asked, never balked at chores, and displayed the knowledge he had gleaned from years at Winterfell. How to track game in the snow, how to identify the signs of wolves or other predators. Slowly, bit by bit, the hostility thawed. Now and then, a man would ask about Pike or the Ironborn. Theon answered truthfully. Harsh lands breed harsh men. Finally, Winterfell's familiar towers rose on the horizon, gray stone dusted by recent snowfall. Theon felt an odd ache in his chest as they approached. Memories of his youth flooded him. Riding with Robb and Jon across the courtyard, sparring with wooden swords, the archery butts near the Godswood, the warmth of the great hall in winter. This place was more of a home than Pike had ever been. They were met by Esther Lewin and a handful of guards at the gates. Bran Stark, now recognized as the Lord of Winterfell in Robb's absence, came forth, perched on the back of Hodder. The sight of the boy's crippled legs struck Theon with renewed guilt. He remembered the day Bran had fallen from the tower, how the tragedy had rocked the entire castle. Yet Bran regarded Theon with wide, curious eyes, not hostility. Did Robb send you? Bran asked in that quiet, straightforward manner of his. Theon dismounted, careful not to muddy his cloak on the melting snow. Aye, little lord. He sends me to help guard Winterfell against a possible attack by the Ironborn. Bran's face flickered with confusion. Your father might attack us? Theon's throat tightened. Yes, he answered. There was no point in gentleness on that matter. We need to be prepared. Maester Luwin gazed at Theon with his kindly, probing stare. Then we must strengthen our defenses. We are glad to have you back, Theon. For a moment, Theon thought he saw true relief in the Maester's eyes. He realized that with Eddard Stark dead, Robb away, and so many men drawn south for the war, Winterfell was indeed vulnerable. Theon's presence, whatever tension it might bring, was at least a sign that Robb had not forgotten his home. In the days that followed, Theon threw himself into the task of reinforcing Winterfell. He scouted the surrounding lands, inspected the walls, organized archery drills for the men and boys who remained. The garrison was small, but the stout walls and sturdy gates of Winterfell were a boon. The castle's natural defenses, along with the hot springs that warmed the interior, lent it an enduring strength. Above all, Theon was determined not to let the Ironborn slip through due to carelessness. He remembered how the Ironborn longships favored surprise, pre-dawn assaults. He ordered the watchers on the towers to keep torches lit at all hours. He taught them signals with horns so the entire castle could be roused swiftly at the first sign of ships or outriders. When men grumbled at these new routines, Theon reminded them that war was at their threshold. Better a false alarm or two, he told them, than a real threat that finds us asleep. Bran was fascinated by every step of the preparations. Sometimes, while Hodder carried him through the courtyard, he would ask Theon about the Iron Islands. What is Pike like? Are the raiders truly unstoppable? Is it true they worship a drowned god? Theon answered patiently. He found, oddly enough, that it felt good to share his knowledge with someone who displayed genuine curiosity rather than scorn. He told Bran of the rope bridges at Pike, the tower perched precariously on a rock spire, the ever-present smell of brine. And yes, he explained the Ironborn faith in the drowned god, how a man was reborn after being held underwater. I never much cared for their ceremonies, Theon admitted. It's harsh. Bran listened with rapt attention. The boy, for all his innocence, had a formidable mind. Theon realized that Robb had left more than a child behind. He had left a Stark. And despite his youth, Bran held the respect of those within Winterfell. If Theon was to protect this castle, he would be protecting something deeply worth saving. Still, doubts knotted Theon's gut. Balon might come. Yara might lead the attack in his stead. Or perhaps the Ironborn would strike another part of the north, circumventing Winterfell entirely. The possibilities were endless. Theon resolved to be ready for any scenario. He conferred with Maester Luwin on rationing, ensuring that the granaries were well stocked. He requested a raven always be kept at the ready should they need to alert Robb to danger. Even if the Ironborn avoided direct confrontation, burning crops and outlying villages was a favored tactic. Theon sent riders to the neighboring holds, warning them to stay vigilant, to retreat behind Winterfell's walls if threatened. Each night, after the day's work was done, Theon found himself haunted by the words Balon had spat at him. You are no son of mine. That particular heartbreak was raw. Despite Balon's cruelty, a sliver of Theon's heart still yearned for some measure of paternal approval. But that was a fool's dream. He would never be accepted on Pike. His only course was forward, to prove himself worthy of the trust Robb Stark had granted him. Weeks passed, the snows creeping into the courtyard in patchy drifts. One morning, word reached them of a minor Ironborn raid near Torrhen's Square. A rider arrived, breathless, to say that a small band of reavers had been spotted landing on the coast, burning some fishermen's huts. Theon reacted at once, conferring with Maester Luwin and Ser Rodrik Castle, who had just returned from an errand to the Tall Heartlands. Ser Rodrik wanted to march out immediately, catch the raiders before they slunk away. Yet Theon hesitated. They might be testing our response, he pointed out. The Ironborn excel at diversion. They might draw our forces away, then strike elsewhere. Ser Rodrik, though bristling, considered Theon's warning. He finally nodded. Then you suggest we wait here? Theon shook his head. We must help Torrhen's Square if we can. But we shouldn't march out in full. Split our forces. Send a detachment to deal with the raiders. Keep the rest garrisoned behind Winterfell's walls. That way, if they do plan a larger assault here, we aren't leaving the castle wide open. After some discussion, Ser Rodrik agreed. He departed with a fraction of Winterfell's men, leaving Theon with the remainder to hold the castle. The fear that thrummed through Theon's veins was tangible. This was exactly the scenario he feared. If Yara or another Ironborn commander had planned a ruse, the next blow would come soon, and it would be aimed at Winterfell itself. Sure enough, just days later, one of the watchers on the walls sounded the horn. 3 blasts, the signal of an unknown force approaching in large numbers. Theon rushed to the battlements, heart hammering. The light was dimming, dusk settling over the fields, but he could make out shapes moving in the distance, shadows of men on horseback, Ironborn? They seldom preferred horses, yet Yara was cunning enough to adapt. The watchers lit more torches. The gates were barred. The men took positions, archers notching arrows, a meager line of spearmen near the drawbridge. Theon's breath billowed in the chilly air, adrenaline coursing through him. He scanned the horizon for the flitter of a kraken sigil or perhaps some cunning subterfuge. Moments stretched. Then, a call from outside the gates, "Open, in the name of House Greyjoy." The voice echoed eerily. Theon's heart sank. So it was them. But why approach openly? He peered over the wall, spotting about 50 riders, ironborn clad in mismatched leathers and mail. They bore no large siege weapons, no visible reinforcements. Had Yara truly come with so few? Or was this just another diversion? He called down, forcing strength into his voice. "This is Theon Greyjoy, sworn man of House Stark. State your purpose or begone." A laugh came from below. He recognized it. Yara. Her voice carried a mocking tone, though it was edged with exasperation. "So the pup stands with the wolves. Open the gates, little brother. We'd parley." Theon ground his teeth. Parley? This felt wrong, but it might be a chance to gauge her strength, her plans. He glanced at the men around him. "We will lower the drawbridge for you alone," he shouted back. "Your men remain outside." Silence. Then Yara's voice again. "Done?" A ripple of unease passed through the defenders. Theon descended to the courtyard, motioning for the men to keep arrows trained on the riders outside. The portcullis rose slightly, enough to allow Yara through, but no more. She rode in on a tall mare, bearing a dark cloak pinned with the kraken of House Greyjoy. Her hair was cropped short at the sides, a practical style for a reaver, and her eyes gleamed with an unsettling mix of amusement and contempt. She dismounted near Theon, ignoring the ring of armed men who surrounded her. "You look well," she said, flicking a glance over him. "Better fed, at least, than when you were sulking on pike." Theon forced himself to maintain composure. "Why are you here?" Yara shrugged, feigning casualness. "I have a proposition. Father sent me to raid the coasts, to draw off Robb Stark's men so the Ironborn might capture more territory. But I persuaded him there might be an easier way. If you want to keep Winterfell, fine. Keep it. Father values the land around Torrhen Square and Deepwood Motte more anyway. Perhaps we leave Winterfell alone if you kneel to Father and swear to hold it for the Iron Islands." Theon snorted. It was a cunning ploy, but transparent. "You expect me to betray Robb again? When I refused Father to his face?" Yara's smirk widened. "You refused him once. But now you see how tenuous your position is. You have only a small garrison here and no sign of reinforcements from your brother, Stark. I've 50 men out there with more ships anchored on the nearby coast. I can crack open these walls if I wish. And Father has more men behind me. He wants the north. If you bend the knee to him, if you open these gates to us, he might show you mercy. You'd hold Winterfell as a steward of House Greyjoy better than dying like a dog." Theon felt fury coil in his gut. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so only Yara could hear. "I made my choice. Robb is my brother, not you. You're not welcome here." A flicker of emotion passed across Yara's face, exasperation, maybe disappointment. "You're a fool. This is your last chance to keep some sliver of peace with Father. If you stand against us, you'll die. You think the Starks will weep for you? They'll bury you with the other casualties of war." She gestured to the castle walls. "You can't hold Winterfell against the entire Iron Fleet." Theon's pulse raced, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I'll die before I betray my oath." Yara nodded slowly as though acknowledging a final boundary. "Then you will die, little brother." She turned toward the gates and raised her voice so the watchers on the battlements could hear. "My men wait outside. By tomorrow's dawn, Father's ships will fill the horizon. Surrender Winterfell by sunrise or I will see these walls burn to cinders." She mounted her horse again, riding out without a backward glance, her footsteps echoing in the tense hush. Once she was gone, Theon exhaled shakily. He realized that every muscle in his body was taut, that he was gripping the hilt of his sword so tightly his knuckles had gone white. A soldier beside him asked quietly, "Is she serious?" Theon turned, scanning the ring of anxious faces. "Yes," he said. "She's serious." Almost immediately, men began talking at once. Could they truly defend Winterfell against the Ironborn? Was Theon simply delivering them all to an early grave? Theon barked for silence. "This is a fortress. Our walls are strong. We have enough provisions to last a siege longer than you might think. If the Ironborn come, we'll hold until Ser Roderick returns, until Robb Stark sends aid." Maester Lewin stepped forward. "We must prepare. Evacuate noncombatants to the Great Keep. Barricade every entry." Bran, who had arrived near the courtyard, looked on with wide eyes. Hodder hovered behind him, uneasy. The boy said nothing, but his face was pale. Theon nodded. Yes. Get everyone inside. We can't risk them in the open. He faced the men again. Anyone who wishes to leave, speak now. I won't force you to stay and fight the Ironborn. Some looked at the ground, uncertain. Others spat on the stones, vowing to remain loyal to the Starks. Eventually, a handful of older servants and a few of the less martial men bowed out, quietly gathering what possessions they could and slipping out the gates to make for the surrounding countryside, hoping perhaps to avoid the war entirely. Theon felt a pang watching them go. Winterfell was emptier, missing the bustle of daily life he recalled. But the ones who remained were determined, or at least resigned. That was something. Through the night, Theon worked tirelessly to position the defenders. Archers on the walls. Oil for boiling. Snares rigged at the gatehouse. He coordinated with Maester Luwin to keep ravens ready. They dispatched one final desperate plea for help to Ser Roderick's column, but it was uncertain if the bird would find them in time. Another raven flew to Robb, yet Theon knew Robb was far away, entangled in battles of his own. Theon prayed that by the time Robb received the message, Winterfell would still stand. Shortly before dawn, Theon took a position atop the main gatehouse, peering out into the gloom. The fields before Winterfell were bathed in moonlight, serene yet full of menacing possibilities. The crisp air stung his lungs. Despite his tension, Theon felt oddly calm. This was what he had chosen. If the Ironborn overran Winterfell, at least he would fall defending the place he called home. Shadows moved in the distance. Quiet footfalls, the faint glint of torches. Theon tensed, raising a hand to signal the archers. Within moments, shapes emerged from the gloom, Ironborn foot soldiers crossing the field in a loose formation. Their approach was cautious. They knew the watchers on the walls would see them eventually. Behind these infantry, Theon glimpsed Yara astride her horse, flanked by a grizzled captain with braided salt and pepper hair. He let them come within shouting distance. Yara, Theon called down. You said by sunrise, and there's hardly a hint of daylight. Turn back or face our arrows. Her laughter rang across the field. We gave you time to think it over, she shouted. But I know my brother's stubborn streak. So be it. She raised a hand and a horn blew in the Ironborn ranks, a low, droning note that rattled Theon's nerves. Arrows from Winterfell's walls answered first, slicing the cold air. An Ironborn soldier collapsed with a cry, an arrow lodged in his shoulder. Another stumbled, clutching at a bolt in his leg. The rest raised crude shields or dodged aside. Return fire was minimal. The Ironborn had few archers, relying more on close combat and the shock of a swift assault. But Winterfell's walls were high and strong. The Ironborn advanced, carrying grapnels and ladders. Theon's archers rained more arrows, thinning their lines. Theon shouted orders, trying to keep a steady rhythm. Focus on the ladders. Keep them off the walls. A crash echoed near the main gate, Ironborn smashing at the wooden barriers with a makeshift battering ram. Theon signaled to the men positioned above the gate, and they poured scalding water down onto the attackers. Screams cut through the dawn air as the Ironborn stumbled back, flesh scalded. For a while, it seemed they might hold. The ladders were cast aside or destroyed, the battering ram efforts thwarted. Then Theon spotted a group of Ironborn slipping around the side of the castle, vanishing from view. He cursed. Yara was no fool. She might have discovered a weak point in the walls. Theon shouted for a small reserve group to circle to the eastern rampart. But confusion reigned amid the chaos. Clashing steel and shouted orders echoed everywhere. A messenger rushed to Theon's side. My lord! The young man was wide-eyed. They found the old Sally Port near the kitchens. They're trying to break through. Theon's stomach lurched. He remembered that door. It was rarely used, but if the Ironborn hammered through, they could flood the courtyard from within. With a curt nod, Theon sprinted down the wall steps, assembling a handful of men with axes and spears. They thundered through the corridors, passing frightened servants who huddled against the walls. At the far end of the keep, near the old kitchens, they arrived just as the Ironborn smashed through the rotting timbers of the Sally Port. A half-dozen of them spilled in, shouting war cries. Theon's men slammed into them. The corridor was narrow, the fighting brutal. Theon's sword clashed with an Ironborn axe. Sparks danced in the torchlight. Theon roared, rage and adrenaline fueling him. He pivoted away from a slash that might have gutted him, then thrust his blade into the attacker's side, feeling the crunch of leather and flesh. Another Ironborn rushed him, a short spear aimed at Theon's chest. Theon barely sidestepped, the spearhead scraping his mail, and a northern soldier cut the man down from behind. Blood spattered the floor. Smoke from the torches stung Theon's eyes. More Ironborn tried to force their way inside. Theon and his companions pressed forward, determined to bottleneck them. "Hold the doorway," Theon shouted. "Don't let them in." His arms felt like lead, each swing of his sword more labored than the last, but he kept fighting. He smashed aside another raider's shield, opening the man's torso to a savage cut that spilled him to the ground. The corridor was a cacophony of screams, steel, and the sickening sound of bone meeting blade. At last, the Ironborn broke, retreating back through the shattered door. Theon's men slammed it shut, jamming a wooden beam across it. Theon gasped for breath. His sword arm ached. Glancing around, he saw 3 of his men were down, including one who'd taken a spear through the throat. Theon's stomach churned as he knelt next to the dying soldier, but the man was beyond help. Blood bubbled at his lips. This was the grim reality of war. Still, they had held the door. Yet the battle wasn't over. Theon hurried back to the courtyard to find that another group of Ironborn had managed to scale a portion of the wall near the first keep. They now fought with the defenders on the ramparts. Arrows whistled overhead. Theon called for reinforcements. All around him, the once quiet Winterfell was transformed into a war zone, the crash of steel resonating between its ancient walls. On the ramparts, a swirl of melee raged. Theon climbed the stone steps 2 at a time, sword gripped in his throbbing hand. He saw an Ironborn about to plunge a dagger into a fallen guardsman. Theon hurled himself forward, blocking the strike. The Ironborn snarled, turning his blade on Theon. Their eyes locked in a flash of recognition. It was Dagmar Cleftjaw, one of Balon's fiercest captains, his face marred by an old scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent half-smile. "So here you are, boy," Dagmar rasped. "Turn cloak of the Iron Islands." Theon spat, raising his sword. "I stand for the Starks now." They traded blows, steel clashing with savage force. Dagmar was strong, experienced, and Theon's arms were already heavy with fatigue. But Theon had the advantage of footing, and he used it. He sidestepped a wide slash, bashing Dagmar's face with the pommel of his sword. Dagmar reeled, blood streaming from his nose. Theon followed with a thrust aimed at his chest. Dagmar twisted aside, but not fast enough. Theon's blade bit into his shoulder, lodging there. Groaning, Dagmar glared at Theon, who yanked his sword free. Dagmar staggered, dropping his axe. For a moment they locked gazes. Then, with a grimace that might have held a shred of respect, Dagmar pitched over the rampart, falling to the courtyard below in a sickening thud. Theon stood, breathing hard. Nearby, the defenders had rallied. The Ironborn who had scaled the walls were either dead or scrambling back down the ladders to safety. Below, Theon could see Yara's banner, but she was wheeling her horse away from the main gate, shouting orders. The dawn light finally broke across the sky, revealing the scale of the carnage. Bodies littered the field outside Winterfell. Arc shapes in the wan light. The portcullis remained closed, the walls held, but how much longer could they keep this up if the Ironborn launched another wave? Theon descended the ramparts, meeting a group of exhausted soldiers in the courtyard. Maester Lewin hurried over, anguish etched in his face. "We've casualties. At least 24 of ours are gone or wounded. I fear what might come next." Theon steadied himself. "We must stay strong. They tested us and we held." Before Theon could catch his breath, a horn sounded from outside, different from the Ironborn horn, a lower, more resonant note. Theon rushed to the main gate once more, peering out. A wave of hope surged in him. Beyond the battered Ironborn lines, he glimpsed banners of a dire wolf and the glint of steel as new forces approached from the west. Could it be Ser Roderick? Or another of Robb's bannermen? A shout rose from the defenders, reinforcements. Indeed, a host of northern riders thundered across the field, smashing into the Ironborn flank. Theon recognized the sigils: Serwyn, Tallheart, Dustin. Ser Roderick must have gotten word from the Raven faster than they'd hoped, or he'd been returning from Torrhen's Square. The Ironborn lines broke in panic, outmaneuvered and outnumbered. Yara, seeing the sudden arrival of a fresh force, tried to rally her men, but the advantage was lost. Arrows and lances cut down the reavers. A cheer erupted from the walls of Winterfell. Theon wasted no time. "Open the gates! Let Ser Roderick in." The battered defenders hastened to comply. Once the portcullis lifted, the northern riders poured into the courtyard, chasing the fleeing Ironborn. Yara's men scattered, some throwing down their weapons, others sprinting for the trees or whatever hope of escape they could find. Yara herself, ever resourceful, wheeled her horse around and galloped away, her personal guard close behind. She likely had a rendezvous with the ships, a path to retreat. Still, the tide was decisively turned. In the courtyard, Ser Roderick dismounted, his face taut with anger and concern. "Theon," he said gruffly, "it seems you did not lie about the threat." Theon shook his head, trying not to let relief break him. "No, Ser Roderick. I thank you for coming." He glanced at the exhausted defenders, many of whom sported wounds. "We held as long as we could, but you arrived just in time." Ser Roderick's expression softened. He placed a gauntlet hand on Theon's shoulder. "You've done well. You saved Winterfell." And it was there, amidst the acrid smell of blood and burning pitch, that Theon felt a surge of emotion. Relief, vindication, sorrow for the fallen. He had chosen his side and in doing so saved the home he had once thought he could never truly claim. Winterfell still stood battered but unbroken. Over the following days, Theon oversaw the cleanup. The dead were buried, the wounded were tended in makeshift infirmaries. The repairs to the damaged wall sections began and the shattered sally port was sealed. Meanwhile, Yara and the remaining Ironborn retreated to their longships on the coast, leaving scattered raiding parties to skirmish with local lords. But the heart of the North, Winterfell, remained in Stark hands. Word spread swiftly of Theon Greyjoy's stand. Some commended him as a loyal defender, others remained cautious, uncertain if he had truly severed all ties to his father. But the victory had given him a foothold in their esteem. He found himself receiving polite nods in the courtyard where once there had been only suspicious glares. Even Bran looked at Theon with something akin to respect. A fortnight later, ravens arrived bearing news from Robb Stark. He had been informed of the Ironborn assault on Winterfell and how Theon had led its defense. He wrote that he was proud of his friend, proud of Winterfell's resilience. He promised further support against the Ironborn once he had settled matters in the Riverlands. Theon read the message, his hands trembling. Robb trusted him. Robb believed in him. Though winter's chill loomed ever closer, Theon walked the castle parapets with a sense of purpose. He remembered that day in Balon's hall, the father who had scorned him, the sister who had mocked him. He felt the faint echo of that heartbreak, but it was tempered by pride in what he had achieved. He had not wavered. He belonged here, in the North. And while a long war still stretched ahead, while dangers still menaced them from Lannisters, from Ironborn, from the uncertain fortunes of kings, Theon felt something he had not felt in years, a sense of belonging that could not be stripped away. In the days that followed, Theon helped organize a new watch system around Winterfell. Ser Roderick departed again, seeking to link up with other northern lords who were battling the Ironborn in scattered skirmishes. Meanwhile, Theon stood guard over Winterfell, ensuring that Yara would not catch them unawares a second time. He found himself forging new bonds with men like Hayhead, the blacksmith's apprentice, who was surprisingly adept with a bow, and old Hob the kennel master, whose hounds patrolled the castle perimeter. One night, Theon even sat around a small fire in the courtyard, sharing stories with the very men who had once doubted his intentions. The looming threat of more Ironborn raids united them. Bran's fascination with Theon's knowledge continued. The boy often asked about the various houses, about how war was waged at sea. Sometimes Theon would see that faraway look in Bran's eyes, as though he were pondering a bigger world than the one inside these walls. Theon tried to encourage him. "You'll rule here one day if something happens. The more you know, the better." Bran tilted his head. "But what if I wanted to see the sea myself?" Theon managed a wry smile. "Perhaps one day you will. It's dangerous, but the world can't be locked away. You'll find your way, Bran." Shortly after, a raven arrived bearing urgent news. The Ironborn, under Victarion Greyjoy's command, had sacked parts of the Stony Shore but were met with fierce resistance from the Manderly fleets out of White Harbor. Theon realized that Balon's ambitions were dangerously broad, that he aimed to carve the entire northern coast for himself. But with each passing skirmish, the North grew more determined. The lords banded together, forging alliances of necessity. And while Theon did not know the final shape of this war, he sensed that Balon might have underestimated the fierce loyalty that tied the North to House Stark. As winter deepened, so did Theon's resolve. He corresponded with Robb through ravens, sending updates on Winterfell's status, the repairs, the morale of the people. Each time, Robb's missives reminded him that once the war in the south was concluded, the king in the north would turn his full might against the Iron Islands if they continued their aggression. Theon knew well the Ironborn's stubborn pride. They would not kneel easily, but they would bleed for their defiance. A part of Theon felt sorrow at that inevitability. Though he hated Balan's cruelty, though he despised the Reaver's savage raids, the Iron Islands were his birthplace. Their destruction would be one more tragedy in a war already drenched in blood. But that was the cost of defiance, of invasion. And Theon had chosen his side. In time, more news filtered in. Stannis Baratheon was defeated at the Blackwater, King's Landing remained in Lannister hands, and Robb Stark faced uncertain alliances in the Riverlands. The North was effectively severed from the rest of the realms by the chaos of war. Yet Theon and the defenders of Winterfell held on. Periodically, small Ironborn warbands would test them, but none succeeded in breaching the castle walls. On one such occasion, Yara herself led a stealthy incursion at night, but Theon's watchers spotted them. The ensuing skirmish left more Ironborn dead. Yara fled, cursing Theon's name. Each clash hardened Winterfell's defenders and forced the Ironborn to realize that Theon Greyjoy would not falter. The passing moons brought a hush of snow across the courtyard. The trees of the godwood stood silent and white, branches bowed beneath the weight of winter's arrival. The ground sparkled in the morning sun, a mirror of the chill in the air. Theon found himself recalling childhood moments here, snowball fights with Robb and Jon, Sansa laughing, Arya fuming whenever she lost a tussle. Even Ned Stark's measured presence, a tall figure watching over his children with pride and love, drifted through Theon's memory. It all felt so close now, closer than anything that had passed on Pike. Despite the war, Theon felt strangely at peace with his choices. One late afternoon, while Theon inspected the watchtowers, Maester Luwin approached him. The older man's demeanor was calm, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Theon, might I have a word?" They retired to Luwin's tower chamber, a snug space warmed by a brazier. The shelves were lined with scrolls and bottles of Raven's ink. Luwin gestured for Theon to sit, then poured him a cup of mulled wine. "I have received a raven from Lord Bolton," Luwin began, the corners of his eyes creasing with worry. "It contains news of Robb Stark's campaigns in the south and also a warning. Lord Bolton says the war goes poorly, that the Lannisters have the advantage in men and resources. He urges a possible truce with the Ironborn to prevent the North from being attacked on two fronts." Theon shook his head, jaw tightening. "A truce? After they've burned our lands? The Ironborn won't rest until they've claimed everything or lost everything." Luwin sighed. "It is complicated. Lord Bolton, he has his own methods. But that's not for me to judge now." He leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Your loyalty to House Stark has been proven here, Theon, but do you truly believe the Iron Islands will relent if faced with a united North?" Theon weighed his words. "Balan is nothing if not stubborn. But if Robb can bring the fight to Pike, he may force them to bend the knee or risk annihilation." Theon swallowed. "I fear much blood will be shed first." Luwin nodded, sadness apparent in his eyes. "War is a dreadful thing, my boy. I only hope the realm does not shatter entirely." In the subsequent weeks, the skirmishes between scattered Ironborn raiders and northern forces escalated. Stories came of fierce battles along the coast. White Harbor's fleet, led by House Manderley, clashed with Ironborn longships in countless raids. The tide of warfare kept shifting, but Winterfell stood firm, a bastion of defiance. Theon's name spread among the northern ranks as a symbol of unlikely loyalty. Some called him Theon the Turncloak, ironically twisting the epithet to mean he had turned cloak against his own father. Others simply muttered that he was a Greyjoy anomaly. But among those who guarded Winterfell, few doubted his dedication any longer. As the war ground on, Theon wondered what final reckoning might await Balan Greyjoy. Could father and son meet on the battlefield? Would Theon be forced to drive steel through the man who sired him? Or might Balan perish on some rocky shore, undone by his own arrogance and the North's vengeance? These were questions that gnawed at Theon in the stillness of night. But his day-to-day reality remained the same: keep Winterfell secure, stand with Bran Stark and Maester Luwin, ensure that the banner of the dire wolf flew high. Eventually, Robb Stark sent word that he had achieved a significant victory in the Riverlands, though the cost was high. The raven carried a personal message for Theon: "You have shown the true steel of your heart. When I return, we will stand together, brothers in name and deed." Theon reread those lines more times than he cared to admit, a knot of pride and relief tangling in his chest. He had spent years striving for a father's acceptance, only to be spurned. Now he had gained a brother's respect. It was enough. That winter, Theon presided over the grisly aftermath of many more small clashes with Ironborn scouts. He rode out occasionally with a handful of men to chase away raiders who threatened local villages. His knowledge of the Ironborn's raiding patterns proved invaluable, and though some of the smaller fishing villages were burned, others were warned in time to hide their provisions or flee inland. Each time Theon rode back through Winterfell's gate, he felt more at home, as though the ancient walls recognized his service. The ghosts of his past, his tense childhood, his uncertain place, seemed to recede with each act of loyalty. One morning, Theon took it upon himself to visit the crypts beneath Winterfell, feeling a strange compulsion to pay respects to the fallen Starks. The damp corridors echoed with his footsteps. Torch in hand, he passed the solemn stone likenesses of old kings in the north, each with a direwolf curled at their feet. He paused before the statues of Rickard Stark, Lyanna Stark, and finally Eddard Stark. He bowed his head, letting the torchlight dance across Ned's stony visage. A memory seized him, Ned Stark's quiet intensity, the way he'd once praised Theon for his archery during a feast day. "You have a good eye," he had said, "and a steady hand. The iron within you is not all from pike. The north shapes you too." Theon closed his eyes. Perhaps Ned had seen something in him that even he had not recognized at the time. Or perhaps Ned had simply been kind. Whichever it was, Theon felt a wave of regret that the man was gone, that he could never witness Theon's stand for Winterfell. But if there were any justice beyond death, Theon hoped Ned might know. When Theon finally emerged from the crypts, he was greeted by a swirl of snow in the courtyard. Hodder stood in his simple clothing, holding Bran on his back, while Maester Luwin spoke with a pair of riders who had arrived. Theon approached, curiosity piqued. The riders carried the banner of House Reed from the neck, a curious detail, as House Reed seldom ventured far from their swamps. "Word from Greywater Watch," one messenger said, voice tight. "More Ironborn raids to the west, near Moat Cailin. They're harassing supply lines." Theon nodded, absorbing the news. It confirmed that Balon was still trying to spread the war across the north even after the failed siege of Winterfell. "We'll send what aid we can," Theon responded, though the garrison here was stretched thin. He wondered if Ser Roderick or other nearby lords might be able to respond more swiftly. Still, he would do his part even if it meant weakening Winterfell's defense for a time. Such was war. In the following weeks, these burdens of command pressed heavily upon Theon. Yet he endured, leaning on Maester Luwin's advice and forging alliances with the local bannermen who recognized that Theon stood with the Starks. The sense of camaraderie grew. Some evenings, around the great hall's hearth, Theon found himself laughing with the men, recalling hunts or old feasts. A barrier had been broken. Theon might be Greyjoy by blood, but he was Stark by choice. Spring struggled to break winter's grip on the north. The snows melted patchily, revealing the muddy earth beneath. The conflict with the Iron Islands continued in fits and starts, but it seemed the Ironborn's momentum had stalled. Balon could raid, but he could not hold any significant northern territory. Theon had no illusions Balon would not cease his ambitions out of mercy. But the north was neither fractured nor leaderless. It had the king in the north, and it had a new unity forged by crisis. One late afternoon, a party of riders approached Winterfell, banners snapping in the wind. The watchers signaled from the walls, and Theon hurried to greet them. As they drew nearer, he recognized the sigil of House Stark, Grey Wind's banner. At the column's head was Robb Stark himself, cloak rippling behind him, auburn hair catching the sun's last glow. Grey Wind bounded at his side, fierce and proud. Theon felt a sudden tightness in his throat. He waited in the courtyard as Robb Stark dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy. Grey Wind trotted forward, sniffing Theon. Then the direwolf let out a low, friendly noise. Robb walked up with a purposeful stride. The two young men regarded each other, countless words unspoken. Finally, Robb clasped Theon's arms. "Well met, brother." Theon bowed his head, relief and joy colliding in his chest. "Your Grace." Robb huffed an exasperated laugh. "Don't call me that, not here in our home." Then he glanced around, taking in the repairs, the new defenses. Soldiers bowed or saluted him. Even with the signs of battle still visible, Winterfell looked secure. "You did it," Robb said softly. "You saved her home." Theon let out a slow breath. "I had help," he replied, glancing at the men who had fought beside him, at Bran watching from a balcony overhead. "Winterfell isn't just walls and towers. It's the people who stand together." Robb nodded, emotion stirring in his eyes. "Thank you, Theon, for standing by us when it mattered most." There was little more to say. They embraced as brothers. The courtyard erupted in applause, the men cheering the return of the king in the north and the loyalty of the Greyjoy who had chosen the Starks. That night, a great feast was held in the hall. It was modest compared to the grand feasts of peacetime, but the mead flowed and the tension that had gripped Winterfell seemed to melt away. Robb sat at the head of the table with Bran at his side. Theon was seated among the honored guests, exchanging toasts with lords and knights who, not so long ago, might have looked upon him with daggers in their eyes. Stories of battles were shared, both from the south against the Lannisters and from the coast against the Ironborn. Men recounted Theon's stand at the battered Sallyport, his skirmishes in the courtyard, the way he'd refused to yield. Robb listened with pride, occasionally meeting Theon's gaze and smiling. Afterward, in a quieter moment beside the hearth, Robb asked Theon about his father and sister. Theon spoke plainly of Balon's threats, Yara's attempts to sway him, the final break with his family. Robb's expression was somber. "I wish it hadn't come to this," he said, "but I'm glad you chose what was right, Theon. We'll deal with the Iron Islands in time. Until then, you are my brother in every way that matters." Theon stared into the flames, thinking of the father who disowned him, the mother he barely remembered, and the sister who despised him for his loyalty to the wolves. "I've lost one family," he said quietly, "but perhaps I've gained another." Robb set a hand on his shoulder, a comforting weight. "You have." Outside, the winds of war still blew. News of battles and shifting alliances poured in daily. But within the walls of Winterfell, something steadfast took root. Theon Greyjoy's loyalty was no longer an uncertain question. He had chosen, and that choice had become the cornerstone of his identity. In defending Winterfell, he had defended a home, a family, and a legacy he had come to cherish more than any claim of blood on the Iron Islands. And so the winter nights passed, the fires crackled in the great hall, and Theon Greyjoy, no longer alone or adrift, would look upon the Stark banner with quiet pride. Balon might rage from his throne of salt, Yara might curse his name, but the North remembered who stood by them. The old gods watched from the silent trees, their faces carved in ancient wood, bearing witness to the man who had at last found his place among wolves. Robb Stark lingered in Winterfell for only a short time before the demands of war called him south again. In that brief span, he laid out plans with Theon and Maester Luwin, conferring on how best to defend the castle and safeguard the North in his absence. In truth, Robb hated to depart. Winterfell was his ancestral seat, one of the last sure strongholds of House Stark, and he yearned to be near his younger brothers. But the war would not wait, and the loyalty of his northern bannermen hinged on his leadership in the field. Theon, he knew, was capable of holding the fortress in his stead. The day Robb departed, the courtyard was a swirl of men saddling horses, gray cloaks and fur mantles fluttering in the wind. Bran sat on Hodder's back, gazing down at his older brother, face pinched with longing. Rickon lurked at Bran's side, Ghost and Shaggy Dog each baring teeth at the bustle. Theon stood near the stables, one hand on Robb's stallion's bridle, steadying the restless beast. Gray wind prowled around the perimeter, ears pricked for any trouble. Attention filled the air. No one knew how many battles still awaited, or whether Robb would return victorious, bloodied, or not at all. Robb clasped Theon's forearm in a firm gesture of trust. "Keep Winterfell safe. Help Bran and Rickon however you can. You've proven yourself already. I know you'll do it again." Theon bowed his head, remembering the sight of the Ironborn storming these very walls. "I won't fail you. My life on it." Robb smiled, though a quiet sadness lurked behind his eyes. Then he swung into the saddle, commanded his men into formation, and with a final wave to his brothers, he thundered out the gates. Cheers rose, but once the dust settled, Winterfell felt eerily quieter. Theon stood in the courtyard, pondering the heavy burden now on his shoulders. Lord of Winterfell in all but name, at least for a time. Perhaps the watchful presence of Ned Stark's statue down in the crypts would keep him honest. Over the following weeks, Theon settled into a careful routine. Each morning, he toured the battlements, checking on the repairs and speaking with the guards. He had grown more comfortable giving orders, and the soldiers responded with polite deference, if not warmth. Most knew him as the man who had refused to let Winterfell fall to the Ironborn, who had fought alongside them in bloody skirmishes. Their caution had softened. They might still have private doubts, but each day Theon proved anew that he was no traitor. He also made time to speak with Bran, who was adjusting to the responsibilities of the castle. Though Bran was technically the Lord of Winterfell in Robb's stead, the boy did not relish making decisions, especially in Ser Roderick's absence. Theon often helped interpret requests from small folk who came seeking aid or justice. Disputes over farmland, stolen livestock, a broken betrothal. These everyday problems had never seemed interesting to Theon before, but now he realized how essential it was for a lord to keep order. And Bran, for all his intelligence, was barely past boyhood. Theon offered counsel, trying his best to echo what Ned Stark might have done. Weigh both sides, be fair, remember that the North is harsh and the small folk rely on strong leadership. Sometimes Theon would see a spark in Bran's eyes as though the boy appreciated this bridging between child and lordling. Meanwhile, ravens brought updates from various fronts, reports of further raids along the coast, of pockets of Ironborn holed-up and captured fishing villages, of House Manderly's ships driving Reaver longboats away from White Harbor. Tension never fully lifted. Theon kept additional patrols riding the roads north and south of Winterfell. On some days, he even joined the patrols himself, wanting to lay eyes on the villages and farms that stretched across the heart of Stark lands. The sight of blackened ruins from earlier raids stoked his anger toward Balon Greyjoy. Each burned field, each frightened family that Theon encountered reminded him that his father had chosen to wage war on innocent folk. The knowledge lent steel to his resolve. As the snows slowly receded and the cold gave way to a damp, uncertain spring, Theon received word of a new threat. Certain lords who claimed loyalty to House Bolton were spreading rumors that the king in the north might be too consumed by battles in the Riverlands to protect the far reaches of his domain. Roose Bolton himself remained ambiguous, always polite in his letters to Robb, but never open with his true intentions. Theon had dealt with Roose Bolton at Robb's war councils and found the man unnerving. There was something serpent-like about him, pale eyes that missed nothing. Yet he was a lord of the north, sworn to House Stark. Theon knew better than to trust him wholeheartedly, but open conflict with Bolton was the last thing they needed when so many foes already lurked at their borders. One day, a small retinue of Bolton men arrived at Winterfell unannounced. They bore the flayed man sigil and claimed to be delivering compliments from Lord Bolton. Theon greeted them in the courtyard, flanked by a handful of Winterfell guards. The leader of the group was a gaunt man named Cleves, with colorless hair and an obsequious manner. He assured Theon they had not come to make trouble. My lord regrets he has been unable to visit, but he hopes to reaffirm his devotion to the king in the north, Cleves said, handing Theon a sealed parchment. Theon eyed the parchment but made no move to open it yet. What's written inside? A simple statement of fealty plus some notes on supply lines. Lord Bolton believes that with the Ironborn scouring the coast, the interior roads must remain clear for trade and troop movements. He suggests mutual patrols. Theon studied him, suspecting there might be hidden barbs in Bolton's proposals. Nonetheless, he had no cause to refuse. We'll review these terms. In the meantime, you'll find hospitality here, provided you abide by Winterfell's rules. I won't tolerate trouble. Cleves bowed low. We're your servants, my lord. That evening, Theon shared the parchment with Maester Luwin and Bran. As he'd suspected, Bolton's letter was full of polite niceties and promises of cooperation, yet it ended with a subtle reminder that when war is upon us, the North must close ranks or be devoured by southern intrigues. Theon found the wording unsettling. Still, it was neither a threat nor a direct affront. They penned a response in Robb's name, thanking Lord Bolton for his loyalty and stating that Winterfell welcomed any Bolton riders who wished to patrol the interior roads in tandem with Stark forces. When Cleves and his men departed the next morning, Theon felt relief. He disliked having those men in the castle as though the stones themselves bristled at their presence. A few weeks later, Ser Roderick Castle returned, bringing additional men who had fought off Ironborn near the rills. The older knight bore fresh scars on his arm and face, but his spirits were high. The Ironborn had suffered a series of setbacks. He brought Theon into a private meeting in the Great Hall, along with Maester Luwin and a half-dozen key soldiers, to discuss strategy. Ser Roderick's gruff voice carried quietly in the echoing hall. We've retaken several villages north of Deepwood Motte. The Ironborn had settled there, but we drove them to the coast. They lost at least 3 ships to storms and Manderly patrols. Word is that Yara Greyjoy has regrouped at Sea Dragon Point. It's likely she'll launch more raids once the weather warms. Theon's jaw tightened at the mention of Yara. He vividly recalled her sneering face when she demanded Winterfell's surrender. What a Balon, he asked. Any sign the old Kraken might recall them to Pike? Ser Roderick shook his head. No. He's stubborn as ever. Some say he's expecting a grand gesture from the new king on the Iron Islands, his brother, Euron, or some cousin. The stories are conflicting. The Ironborn remain fractious, but Balan is nothing if not relentless. We can likely expect more attempts to bleed the north where it's vulnerable. Theon considered the map spread out on the long table. Familiar names dotted the coastline: Torrens Square, the Stony Shore, Cape Kraken. We can't chase them everywhere at once, he said. They strike and vanish by sea. We need a decisive blow. Something that warns them off for good. Ser Roderick grunted. Easier said than done. Even if we gather a fleet, we've no time or resources to sail to Pike ourselves. Not with Robb fighting in the Riverlands. Maester Luwin tapped the table thoughtfully. We may not need to conquer Pike, merely to hold what we have until Robb can consolidate his position in the south. Once the Lannisters are pushed back, their hold on the coasts might weaken as well. And the Ironborn, lacking the means to storm inland, will slink away rather than face a united north. Theon did not entirely share the Maester's optimism, but he nodded. Then we maintain vigilance. I'll go west soon with a contingent of men to reinforce Deepwood Motte. If Yara's targeting that region, we'll be ready. Ser Roderick and Luwin agreed. Plans were set for Theon to assemble a small force of Winterfell soldiers, those who could be spared without leaving the castle itself underdefended, and march for Deepwood Motte. It would be Theon's first campaign of note since the siege that nearly took Winterfell. A flicker of nerves coiled in his belly, but also a sense of pride. He remembered Ned Stark's words long ago in the courtyard: "Fear cuts deeper than swords if you let it, lad. Face it head-on and you may find it's not so terrible." Theon intended to face the Ironborn head-on indeed. Bran saw him off on the morning they departed, the castle courtyard once again bustling with men and horses. Theon paused by Bran, who was perched on Hodder's broad back. Rickon was off somewhere chasing the wolves. The boylord looked solemn. "Will you be gone long?" Bran asked. Theon shrugged slightly, adjusting the fur cloak on his shoulders. "Long enough to chase some raiders away. I'll be back once Deepwood Motte is safe." Bran's voice went quiet. "I trust you." That simple statement touched Theon more deeply than any stirring speech. Bran had no father present, only older siblings and guardians. Yet he was leaning on Theon. Theon reached out, gave Bran's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Watch over Winterfell while I'm gone. You do that, and I'll see to it that no Ironborn set foot in these walls again." Bran nodded, his eyes brimming with a mixture of admiration and worry. Theon led a column of about 60 men westward, Ser Roderick remaining at Winterfell to see to the castle's protection. Their pace was steady but not rushed, the roads still muddy from the thawing snow. Villages they passed were subdued, though people came out to wave or quietly cheer. Theon felt the weight of their hopes pressing on him. At night, they camped in whatever shelter they could find, often a half-dilapidated barn or the lee of a stony hill. Theon insisted on rotating watches diligently. Ironborn scouts could appear at any moment, and no one intended to be caught sleeping. On the fourth day, they reached the outskirts of Deepwood Motte, a stout fortress belonging to House Glover. Pine forests loomed thick around the motte, and the land sloped down to rocky shores that gave partial harbor to a few fishing hamlets. The region had been harried by Yara's raiders earlier in the year, but rumor had it she'd since withdrawn, leaving behind a small occupying force that had now been ousted by local Northmen. The castle's gates opened as Theon's host approached, revealing the battered banner of House Glover, a mailed fist on a red field still hanging from the ramparts. At the gatehouse, a guard recognized the sigil of House Stark on Theon's men and called for the portcullis to rise. They were met by Galbart Glover, a lean man with a bandaged hand. He greeted Theon with a guarded expression. "I was told to expect reinforcements, but I didn't realize Lord Stark was sending you," Glover said, clearly uncertain what to make of a Greyjoy in command of northern soldiers. Theon dismounted, returning the man's gaze. "I'm here on Robb Stark's orders. I am sworn to defend the north, especially from any further Ironborn attacks in this region." Galbart studied Theon's face, then nodded curtly. "We've driven them away for the moment, but they'll try again, no doubt. My brother Robert is off fighting in the south with the king in the north, so we're short-handed. I'll gladly accept any help we can get." Inside the castle, Glover offered Theon a sparse meal of bread and salted fish. They spoke of Yara Greyjoy's tactics: small landings at dawn, sabotage of outlying farms, attempts to starve the fortress into submission. The Glover forces had suffered heavy losses, though they'd managed to retake Deepwood Motte once Yara withdrew. "She tested our strength, then slipped off," Glover said bitterly, flexing his bandaged hand. "We suspect she's regrouping at Sea Dragon Point. Could be waiting for fairer weather to launch a bigger assault. The pine forests around here are thick, and the terrain can be turned against us if we're not careful." Over the next few days, Theon led scouting parties to the coastline, mapping out potential landing sites the Ironborn might favor. He'd grown up around ships, tides, and rocky shores, so he had some insight to share with the Glover men. Together, they identified several beaches that offered easy access for longships, and Theon made sure each was guarded. They erected crude watchtowers where possible, using logs from the abundant forest. Each evening, Theon returned to Deepwood Motte, exhausted from trudging through damp woods, but quietly determined. He ate with the men, checking morale. While some recognized him and treated him with hesitant acceptance, others still recalled the name Greyjoy with a snarl. If Theon overheard a murmur of distrust, someone muttering that he was a kraken pup, he ignored it. Let them talk. Actions would speak louder. 1 week into his stay, a fierce storm battered the coast, forcing Theon's scouts to take shelter. For a night and a day, rain lashed the timbers of the motte, lightning illuminated the forest, and the wind howled through the pine boughs like hungry wolves. Theon stood on the ramparts, drenched, scanning the darkness for any sign of enemy ships. None appeared, yet his instincts prickled. Storms often scattered the watchers, and if Yara was cunning, she might use that to her advantage. By daybreak, the storm receded, leaving the ground slick with mud and fallen pine needles. Theon gathered a group of 15 men, mostly archers, and a pair of trackers from House Glover, intending to survey the coastline for damage or signs of new landings. The air smelled of damp earth and sea brine. Thick fog clung to the low ground, obscuring vision. They ventured out on horseback, heading for a cove about 2 miles west of the main road, a place Theon suspected might be a prime target for landing. The ride was grimly silent, the men on edge. Every snapping twig or rustling bush set them reaching for their weapons. Finally, they emerged onto a strip of rocky shoreline flanked by high cliffs. The tide was out, revealing a stretch of sand littered with kelp. Theon raised a hand, halting the group. He dismounted, carefully scanning the horizon. Peering through the fog, he thought he glimpsed a shape on the shore. He signaled 2 of the trackers to fan out. They moved quietly, bows ready. The minutes stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Theon kept his sword hand loose but prepared, eyes straining to see through shifting mist. A whistle from one of the trackers drew Theon forward. The man pointed at something half-buried near the waterline, a wrecked rowboat, waves lapping at its splintered hull. Several footprints dotted the sand, leading inland. Theon crouched to examine the boat. The construction had the marks of Iron Island's craftsmanship, rough timbers, thick tar. He felt his heart quicken. Someone had come ashore, and it was recent. The footprints looked fresh, no more than a few hours old. He motioned his men to follow the prints up the beach and into a copse of wind-bent pines. The ground was thick with needles and muck. Fog drifted between the trunks. The atmosphere felt claustrophobic, every sound amplified. Theon imagined Yara's mocking laughter, remembered how swift Ironborn could be with ambushes. They advanced slowly, 2 by 2, scanning every angle. Abruptly, one of the archers froze, drawing an arrow. Theon followed the man's gaze to see movement behind a stand of briars. Then a figure darted out, a young woman, bedraggled, cloak-torn, stumbling as she tried to flee. She was not Ironborn, Theon realized at once. Her clothing suggested a commoner, maybe a fisher's daughter. She let out a cry and tried to run, only to collapse in the mud. Theon and his men approached cautiously. She cowered, eyes wide with terror. A bruise marred her cheek, and she trembled so violently she could hardly speak. Theon knelt beside her. "We're from Deepwood Motte," he said gently. "Who are you?" Her breath came in ragged gulps. Finally she managed, They took me. The Ironborn burned my village." She pointed vaguely at the wrecked rowboat. "We tried to escape, but they caught us." Tears filled her eyes. "I ran when the storm hit. They were huddled in a cave. I had to get away." Theon looked around warily, half expecting a party of raiders to leap out from behind the pines. "How many are there?" She shook her head, struggling to recall. "Maybe 10, maybe 15. Not many. They said they were scouts. Tired of waiting on bigger forces." One of Theon's trackers frowned. "We should find them and kill them before they slip away and do more damage." Theon agreed. He helped the woman stand, offering her a water skin. She drank greedily. "We'll get you to safety," he said, "but first, lead us to this cave if you can." She described the path as best she could, still shivering. Theon ordered 2 of his men to escort her back to the beach, give her a horse, and see her safely to Deepwood Motte. The rest would press on to the cave. Fog swirled as they resumed their cautious advance. Step by step, they picked their way through wet underbrush. Eventually, they heard the distant crash of surf against rocks. The trees thinned, revealing a narrow ravine that sloped down to a hidden cove. At the far end, half concealed by boulders, was the dark mouth of a cave. Theon signaled for silence. They dismounted, tying their horses to a stand of pines, and crept forward on foot. The rocky ground was slick, forcing them to move slowly. Wind gusts off the sea carried the salt tang that Theon knew so well. His pulse hammered in his ears. If the Ironborn scouts were holed up inside, they might have a sentry posted. One of the Glover trackers pointed to a vantage on a small rise overlooking the cave. From there, Theon and a handful of archers could perhaps fire down if the Ironborn rushed out. Another group could approach the mouth from the flank. Theon liked the plan. He divided his men accordingly, 6 archers on the rise, 4 with him on the ground. As they positioned themselves, a flicker of torchlight glowed from inside the cave. Theon saw a silhouette pacing near the entrance, a sentry indeed, a lean figure with a short spear, glancing outward at intervals. Theon crouched behind a boulder, heart-pounding. One misstep and they'd lose the advantage of surprise. He signaled the archers with a series of hand motions. They knocked arrows aiming at the sentry. Theon held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Before the last finger folded, an arrow whistled through the air. The sentry lurked, head letting out a strangled cry as he fell sideways, torch sputtering in the wet sand. Instantly, shouts erupted from within the cave. Theon and his ground team sprinted forward, swords drawn. More Ironborn burst out of the dark, yelling war cries. One swung an axe at Theon's shoulder. Theon twisted aside, sweeping his sword up to deflect. Their blades clashed, jarring his arm. An arrow from the overhead archers took the man in the throat, and he collapsed. Another raider lunged with a rusty sword toward one of Theon's men, but Theon kicked him back, delivering a savage cut across the raider's abdomen. Blood spattered. The cave mouth filled with chaos. Firelight from a single torch danced across steel and stone. Theon heard curses in the harsh dialect of Pike, recognized the scowling face of a man he'd once seen in Balan's hall. So these were truly his father's men, half-starved and desperate. They came in ragged waves, obviously reeling from the ambush. One tried to flee deeper into the cave, but a Glover tracker pursued. Shouts echoed, followed by the crash of weapons. An Ironborn with a wild beard charged Theon, bellowing, "Turncloak." A heavy cudgel whistled down. Theon barely sidestepped, feeling the whoosh of air. He sliced his blade across the man's forearm, forcing him to drop the weapon. The raider grappled Theon, fingers clawing at his face. They stumbled, boots skidding on wet stone, until Theon rammed his shoulder forward, toppling the man. A flash of steel, and Theon ended him with a thrust to the chest. Warm blood soaked Theon's gloved hands. All around, the clash raged for a few moments longer before the last of the Ironborn surrendered or lay dead. The gloom of the cave flickered with dying torchlight. A few crates of stolen goods sat by the walls, along with scattered weapons and damp bedrolls. The stench of unwashed bodies mingled with brine. Panting, Theon surveyed the aftermath. He had a gash along one forearm where a blade had caught him, but it was shallow. 3 of his men lay wounded, 1 seriously but still alive. They counted 9 dead Ironborn and 4 more who had yielded. Theon's men bound these survivors' hands and dragged them into the open air. Outside, the fog still clung to the coastline. Theon glanced at the battered captives, mostly young men who looked half-starved. "You are Balan Greyjoy's men?" he demanded. One spat on the ground, glaring at him with open hatred. "We serve the true king of the Isles, not a traitor who kneels to wolves." Theon suppressed a surge of anger. "King, is he? Here you are, cowering in a cave, raiding fisherfolk. Is that your victory?" The man said nothing further. He simply held Theon's gaze with sullen malice. Theon was no stranger to the Ironborn code. They would not plead for mercy. They believed in the drowned god's harsh creed. Theon tried to quell the bitter taste in his mouth. Perhaps these men deserved no mercy. Yet they were prisoners now, and the North had its own customs of war. He glanced at the Glover men. "We'll take them back to Deepwood. Lord Glover can decide their fate. No doubt the punishment for pillaging northern lands would be grim, maybe a life in the dungeons or a swift execution." Theon doubted any words he said would sway them. Yet a part of him regretted the necessity. Every Ironborn captive was a reminder of the blood feud that still burned between his father and the rest of Westeros. They gathered what supplies they could from the cave, freeing 2 cowering fisherfolk in the process, then returned to their horses. By the time they trudged back to Deepwood, dusk was settling. The men were weary but triumphant, hauling the Ironborn captives along. Galbart Glover received the news with grim satisfaction. "This is a small victory," he told Theon, "but a victory nonetheless. Perhaps it will dissuade other raiding parties from testing us so openly." That night, Theon sat by the hearth in the great hall, drinking a cup of watered wine to steady his nerves. He replayed the battle in his mind, the swirl of fog, the sting of salt air, the savage clash of steel. He had killed men whose oaths to House Greyjoy were etched in their hearts from birth, as his might have been had circumstances been different. He felt a pang of disquiet. But he also recalled the battered face of that fisherman's daughter who'd run from the cave, the burned remains of her village. These Ironborn thrived on cruelty and conquest. If he had wavered, they would have done worse. A voice broke into his thoughts. Well fought today. It was a Glover soldier, a young man named Kel, who had accompanied Theon on the raid. He stood with a bandaged arm, regarding Theon with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Never expected to fight alongside a Greyjoy, he admitted, a hint of sheepishness in his tone. But you saved my life when that axeman nearly took my head. Theon shrugged. You would have done the same for me, or at least I hope so. Kel nodded. I would. Just wanted to say. I'm grateful. People talk, but I've seen the truth with my own eyes. He extended his good hand to clasp Theon's forearm. For a moment, Theon felt a flicker of warmth. Slowly, grudgingly, the North was accepting him, one battle at a time. He parted from Kel with a faint smile, finishing his drink in silence. That night, he slept poorly, plagued by half-remembered images of the men he'd slain, of Yara's scornful grin. Yet come dawn, he rose with renewed purpose. If more Ironborn landed on this shore, they would find Theon Greyjoy waiting. In the weeks that followed, Theon maintained the watch. He led small sorties against scattered raiders, aided House Glover in fortifying outlying villages, and personally accompanied supply wagons between Deepwood Motte and Torrens Square. Skirmishes broke out now and then, leaving more Ironborn bodies to rot in the damp pine forests. Each time, Theon felt the pull of conflicting emotions. He remembered Pike's windy towers, the taste of salt on his lips, the raw chanting of the drowned men. That had been the world he was born into. But the North had shaped him into someone else. During this time, a raven arrived from Winterfell bearing a terse message from Maester Luwin. Robb Stark had fought a fierce engagement at the crag. He'd scored a victory, but at great cost. Theon read the lines describing the heavy losses, clenched his jaw at the mention of lords and knights who had fallen. War was relentless. The letter also contained a note that Roose Bolton had moved south with a portion of his force, supposedly to assist the king in the north, though the maester's tone suggested caution. Watch for any sign of further discord, Luwin wrote. Bolton is an ally, but we do not know his full mind. Theon penned a reply, confirming Deepwood Motte was still secure and that he remained vigilant for Ironborn activity. He hoped his news would hearten Robb at least a little. Indeed, the coast around Deepwood Motte was quieting. Yara had yet to mount a large-scale attack, perhaps waiting for fresh ships or perhaps deterred by the increasingly robust defenses. As spring ripened, the forest turned lush and the days grew longer. Theon took to riding patrol each morning, letting the scents of pine and moss fill his lungs. He found unexpected satisfaction in protecting these lands. Once he might have scoffed at such a notion. Now he realized that belonging did not hinge on blood alone. It hinged on loyalty, on shared struggles, on common cause. At last, word arrived that Robb Stark was returning north, accompanied by his mother, Lady Catelyn, as well as a host of lords from the Riverlands who had pledged to continue the fight. They intended to pass through Moat Cailin, call a council at Winterfell, and decide how best to end the Ironborn threat for good. Theon felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of seeing Robb again, of reuniting with the greater Stark host. He consulted with Galbart Glover, who agreed that Theon should bring a contingent of men east to meet Robb's approach. Glover himself would remain to safeguard Deepwood Motte. Before Theon departed, he paid a visit to the dungeons where the Ironborn captives were kept. The corridors below Deepwood Motte were cramped and damp, the smell of stale air and despair palpable. He found the men slumped in individual cells, fed enough to keep them alive but left to fester in the gloom. Flies buzzed around them. They stirred as Theon approached, groping at the bars with calloused hands, their faces gaunt and hollow. One prisoner spat at Theon's feet. Balon Greyjoy will avenge us, he growled. Theon stared, remembering how once he might have felt a stir of pride at the mention of his father's name. Now he felt only resignation. It seems he's left you to rot, Theon said softly. The North is no easy prey. The man cursed him, called him a traitor, a thrall. But the venom in his voice was undercut by desperation. Theon simply watched for a moment, then shook his head and turned away. Though Glover's jailer offered to let him carry out any punishment, Theon refused. He wanted no part in torturing or executing these wretches. Their fate would rest with Lord Glover's judgment. Theon had already spilled enough blood. He set off the next morning with 24 men, forging an eastward road through damp forests and rolling hills. The journey took them many days, slowed by the occasional swollen river or thick mud, but eventually they reached the main route leading toward Moat Cailin. There, they found an encampment of northern soldiers bearing Stark banners having arrived in advance of Robb. Some recognized Theon immediately, greeting him with nods or salutes. Word of his defense of Winterfell and subsequent campaigns in the west had spread, so the stares of distrust were fewer now. 2 days later, Robb arrived. The king in the north rode at the head of a sizable column, his armor dusty from the road, grey wind padding alongside. Lady Catelyn was with him, her features drawn with worry but dignified as ever. Several lords followed, among them the great Jon Umber, Lord Karstark, and the surviving Tully men from Riverrun. Another banner flew among them, Roose Bolton's flayed man. Bolton himself was not visible in the vanguard, but some detachment of his knights accompanied the king's host. Theon stepped forward. Robb's face lit with a weary but genuine smile. He swung from the saddle, clasping Theon's forearm. "It's good to see you, brother." Theon noted the shadows under Robb's eyes, the subtle lines of strain. War was taking its toll. "Likewise. I'm glad you've returned safely." Robb introduced Theon to a few new arrivals, men from the Riverlands who had pledged fealty. Lady Catelyn offered Theon a measured smile. Though her gaze flickered with a hint of wariness, no doubt she still recalled Theon's father's treachery, she inclined her head graciously. "Your defense of Winterfell has not gone unnoticed. My children are safe because of you." Theon bowed. "I swore an oath to Robb and House Stark. I'll keep it." That night, the encampment buzzed with activity as men prepared tents and cooked meals over open fires. Theon joined Robb, Lady Catelyn, and several lords in a large command tent to discuss the next moves. The Greyjoy and others recounted their battles in the west. Theon added his own reports from Deepwood Motte, and Lady Catelyn explained that she had been negotiating alliances in the Riverlands, hoping to secure more troops. "It seems the Lannisters are on the defensive for the moment, locked in conflict with Stannis Baratheon's forces near Storm's End," she said. "We have an opportunity to focus on retaking the northern coasts from the Ironborn. If we can rid our lands of that threat, then we can push south again without fear of our homes burning behind us." Roose Bolton's representative, a soft-spoken knight named Dallin, offered a suggestion. "If we commit a large force to the west, we risk leaving Moat Cailin and the central road underdefended. We must ensure the main approach from the south remains secure." Robb nodded, expression thoughtful. "True. We can't strip the interior bare. Let's consider a two-pronged strategy, one force to sweep the western coast, another to guard Moat Cailin and Winterfell. Once the Ironborn are driven back to their ships, we fortify the shoreline. Theon, you know their ways. Would that suffice?" Theon inclined his head, recalling the shifting tides of Ironborn strategy. "It should. They're vulnerable if they lose the element of surprise. If we seize their longships or block their landing sites, they can't hold territory. Yet be warned, Yara is cunning. She'll strike where we're weakest if she sees an opening." Robb leaned over the map, a battered thing smudged with ink and wine stains. He tapped the coastline west of Deepwood Motte. "We'll gather a strong host here, near the rills, under the command of Lord Bolton and Lord Serwyn. They'll sweep north, burn out any Ironborn enclaves. Meanwhile, I'll lead a second column up the stony shore to converge at Deepwood Motte. With Theon's guidance, we can catch Yara in a pincer if she attempts to hold the region. If she flees by sea, we'll chase her off. If she stands and fights, we destroy her." Theon felt a ripple of apprehension at the mention of Lord Bolton leading one half of the plan. But he said nothing, only nodded. Perhaps it was wise to leverage Bolton's forces. They were numerous and had not taken as many losses in the recent southern battles. If the man remained loyal, this strategy could work. Plans were set, ravens dispatched. Over the next days, the armies divided. Men from houses Umber, Serwyn, Mormont, and Manderley joined the western host, while Robb's personal guard, along with Karstark riders, would push up the stony shore. Theon remained with Robb, assigned as a key scout. They marched at a steady pace, supply wagons trundling behind. Theon recognized the hardships of war etched into every face, too many battles, too many friends lost, and still no end in sight. Yet the camaraderie was tangible. "The king in the north," men would shout as Robb passed. That cry had become a rallying beacon in these dark times. Marching along the stony beaches, Theon couldn't help but recall a half-forgotten sense of awe whenever he'd traveled by sea as a boy. The crashing waves against the rocks, the tang of salt that lingered on the wind, these were as familiar to him as the winter snows that had blanketed Winterfell. Now they symbolized a battleground. At night, as the army camped, Theon often stood on the shore, letting the surf lap at his boots, eyes scanning the black horizon. He wondered if Yara was out there, perched on the deck of some longship, eyeing the flicker of their campfires with a savage grin. One afternoon, Theon rode ahead with a small vanguard scouting an inlet rumored to harbor Ironborn ships. Tall pines swayed overhead and the crashing waves echoed in the distance. Cresting a ridge, they spotted a cluster of 4 longships moored in a narrow cove. Smoke rose from behind a rocky outcrop, likely an encampment. The vanguard withdrew to report. Robb ordered an immediate strike, hoping to catch them by surprise before they could flee. Theon guided the column toward a hidden approach. They dismounted, leaving half the men to circle around from the beach while the other half advanced through the trees. As they closed in, Theon caught glimpses of Ironborn milling near the ships, perhaps 40 or 50, some repairing hulls, others unloading supplies. The Northmen spread out, bows nocked, swords at the ready. Robb gave the signal. Arrows rained down. Panicked yells erupted from the shore as the Ironborn scrambled for cover or tried to sprint onto the ships. Theon led a charge from the flank, hacking down a startled raider who emerged from behind a stack of barrels. Grey wind bounded among them, snarling and snapping. More arrows flew, men screamed. Theon's heart pounded, every sense heightened. Battle had become so frequent and yet it never lost its lethal edge. Some Ironborn managed to cast off in a small rowboat, presumably to alert the others. Theon cursed but focused on the immediate threat. He locked blades with a raider who bellowed, "Traitor." Theon slammed his sword aside, driving a knee into the man's gut, then finished him with a thrust. The surf foamed pink with blood. Another Ironborn swung a rusted mace at Theon's head. Theon ducked, pivoted, and took the raider's legs out from under him with a savage slash. The man collapsed, water swirling around him. Within minutes, the Ironborn force was broken. Those who survived were either cornered on the beach or left floating face down in the shallows. Robb's men set about torching the moored longships, dousing them with oil. Flames leapt high, reflected in the choppy sea. Theon watched the planks blister and crackle, smoke curling into the sky. He felt no satisfaction, only grim acceptance. Another chunk of Balan's ambition went up in flames. Breathless, Robb approached, wiping sweat from his brow. Casualties? One of the captains replied, "We lost a handful, maybe 5 or 6. Another dozen wounded. The Ironborn are all dead or captured." Robb nodded, then turned to Theon. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Robb pressed his hand on Theon's shoulder. "Good work," he said quietly. Theon offered a brief nod in return. They pressed on. In the weeks that followed, multiple skirmishes played out along the stony shore. Some raids were mere fleeting engagements, pockets of Ironborn fleeing deeper into the pines, others attempting to put to sea at the sight of the Stark banners. Each time, Theon used his familiarity with shoreline tactics to outmaneuver them, leading flanking maneuvers or coordinating archers to rain death from the cliffs. Robb's force advanced steadily north, reclaiming villages and burning any Ironborn vessel they found. Theon realized that, bit by bit, the Ironborn stranglehold on the coast was slipping. Eventually, they neared the region near Sea Dragon Point. Scouts reported signs of a larger Ironborn camp, possibly commanded by Yara herself. The tide of war was about to crest. Robb called a council of his principal commanders in the shelter of a tall pine grove. Theon joined them, weary but resolute. Robb's face was smudged with dirt, the lines of command etched deeper. "The Ironborn are concentrated here," he said, pointing to a roughly drawn map on parchment. "If we strike hard, we can scatter them. That leaves the coast from here to Deepwood Motte free." Lord Karstark, face grim after losing 2 sons in prior battles, nodded. "We have enough men to force a direct assault, or we can try luring them out. They might be well fortified behind those rocky ridges." Theon gazed at the map. "Yara knows we're coming. She'll be ready for a straightforward attack. Might be better to bait them into open ground. If we can feign a smaller scouting party, perhaps she'll pounce, thinking it's an easy victory. Then the main host can flank her." Robb rubbed his chin, considering. "That's risky. We'd need men willing to risk the feigned retreat." "I'll lead that group," Theon said without hesitation. "She wants my head. She might commit if she sees me isolated." A hush fell over the group. Robb locked eyes with Theon. "That's dangerous. You realize if she manages to pin you down now." Theon shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "I'm no stranger to danger. Besides, if it breaks her force once and for all, it's worth the risk." Karstark and a few others nodded slowly. Robb exhaled, tension in his posture. "Very well. Choose 2 or 3 dozen riders for the bait. The rest will wait concealed in the pines. If Yara takes the bait, we close the trap." At dawn the next day, Theon led a small band of mounted men along a narrow trail toward the Ironborn camp. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the early sun glinting on damp leaves. His stomach churned with adrenaline. Each horse's hoofbeat on the soft ground felt too loud. The plan was for Theon's group to ride near the Ironborn position, make themselves visible, then retreat, drawing Yara's warriors into an ambush. Robb, meanwhile, lay in wait with the bulk of the army. They rounded a bend and saw smoke from the Ironborn fires. A cluster of tents nestled by a rocky beach with at least 100 men and women bustling around. It was indeed a large camp. Theon spotted the banner of House Greyjoy Blackkraken on a gold field tied to a driftwood pole. His heart jolted. Yara was here. His sister. His enemy. One of Theon's riders muttered, "Gods, that's more of them than we expected. Are you sure about this?" Theon forced a tight smile. "Stick to the plan." At his signal, they rode closer, letting the Ironborn see them. A horn blasted from the camp and the Ironborn quickly armed themselves, forming ragged lines. He glimpsed Yara's unmistakable figure at the forefront, her short-cropped hair, the easy confidence in the way she handled her axe. She spotted Theon immediately, even at a distance, and he could almost see her face twist into a contemptuous grin. Theon spurred his horse, turning back the way he'd come. With a roar, the Ironborn surged forward, Yara at their head. Arrows whistled past Theon's group. One of his men let out a cry, tumbling from the saddle. The rest galloped hard, feigning panic. Theon gritted his teeth. He wanted to turn and fight, but that would ruin the plan. They needed the Ironborn to give chase far enough to be encircled. Heart-pounding, he led the riders down a winding path through the pines. The Ironborn followed, shouting and howling like hunting wolves. Theon heard Yara's voice ringing over the din, "After him. Take his head." Branches whipped against Theon's face. He tasted blood on his lip where a twig had scraped him. Their small group thundered around another bend. There, concealed behind thick stands of pine, were Robb's men. The trap sprang. Horns bellowed and northern soldiers rushed in from both sides, cutting off the Ironborn's advance. Startled, the Ironborn faltered. Then the forest exploded into chaos, clashing steel, screams, trampling horses. Theon wheeled his steed around, charging back into the melee. He locked eyes with Yara across the crush of bodies. She was dismounted, hacking at a northern spearman. Her eyes blazed with battlelust. Before Theon could reach her, a knot of Ironborn closed in on him. He ducked a hammer blow, slashed a rider from his saddle, and parried another spear thrust. The din was overwhelming. He glimpsed Robb fighting near the center, gray wind snarling at a fallen foe. Another cluster of Karstark men hammered at the Ironborn flank, forcing them deeper into the trap. The pines shook with the fury of the conflict. Finally, Theon broke free of the tangle, spurring his horse toward Yara. She saw him coming and kicked a dead man aside, stepping clear with her axe raised. For an instant, Theon hesitated. This was his sister, and they had grown up in the same brutal keep. Yet she would not hesitate to kill him. He swung down from the saddle, sword in hand, to face her on foot. Yara spat in the dirt. "You coward! You lead them like a whipdog. Is this what Balan's son has become?" Theon's grip on his sword tightened. "I'm no coward. I stand for something that matters, honor. The good of the people we once sought to burn." She laughed, circling warily. "You always were too soft. Father was right to disown you." He lunged, steel ringing on her axe. She twisted away with surprising agility, retaliating in a broad sweep that nearly caught Theon's knee. He sidestepped, slashing at her flank. She blocked again, the force jarring his arm. Sparks flew. She was strong, fueled by anger. Their footsteps shuffled in the pine needles, bodies of fallen warriors scattered around them. In the swirl of chaos, Yara managed a feint, then a cut that scored across Theon's left side, a sharp sting that nearly sent him reeling. Pain flared, warm blood soaking through his tunic. Gritting his teeth, Theon mustered his strength. She sneered. "Beg me for mercy, brother. Maybe I'll make it quick." Theon answered with a furious slash that battered her axe aside. She recovered, but not before Theon slammed his blade toward her midsection. She twisted, the blow slicing across her ribs. She hissed in pain, staggering back, hand pressed to the wound. Her eyes glinted with a mix of rage and something like sorrow. A moment stretched between them. They both panted. Theon realized that this was the woman who'd once teased him about being a green boy, who'd first introduced herself under false pretenses when he returned to Pike, leading him to embarrassing missteps. She was family, yet she'd led the assault on Winterfell, threatened to kill everyone inside. She would never stop. A shrill horn blast rang out from deeper in the forest. Theon saw the Ironborn lines collapsing under the northern onslaught. Men were fleeing, some tossing aside weapons. Yara's expression turned from contempt to fierce resolve. She spat blood, pulled back, and hurled her axe at Theon in a desperate attempt to cover her escape. He barely dodged in time, the axe spinning past his shoulder to thunk into a tree trunk. By the time he steadied himself, Yara was running, calling her men to withdraw. Theon sprinted after her, ignoring the pain in his side. He glimpsed her leap astride a riderless horse, hauling another wounded Ironborn up behind her. Then she galloped off into the maze of pines. Theon swore under his breath, but his own horse was lost somewhere in the melee, and the pain made it impossible to chase her on foot. For a moment, he stood in the swirling smoke of battle, breath ragged, unsure if he was relieved or furious she had escaped. Shouts and steel still clashed all around. The Ironborn center was broken, their lines scattered. Robb's forces pressed them mercilessly, capturing or killing those who remained. Eventually, the noise subsided into the groans of the wounded and the crackle of small fires. The king in the north emerged, drenched in sweat, his sword spattered with blood. "It's done," Robb said, scanning the carnage. "They're broken." His gaze fell on Theon's wound, the blood staining his side. "Are you badly hurt?" Theon shook his head, though pain radiated with each breath. "It's nothing." Yara escaped. Robb pressed his lips tight. "We'll hunt her down. For now, we've shattered her main camp. She'll have trouble regrouping." Soldiers began combing the field, stripping weapons from the dead, hauling prisoners together. Mournful cries of the wounded pierced the still air. The pine forest was trampled, a testament to how swiftly violence could mar even a pristine landscape. A Karstark maester examined Theon, cleaned and stitched the cut in his side. He pronounced it a deep but not fatal wound, as long as it didn't fester. Theon sat on a fallen log, letting the man bind him in linen bandages, all the while listening to the subdued aftermath of the battle. Part of him felt an odd hollowness. Another part was simply relieved to be alive. Robb joined him, kneeling in the pine needles. Gray wind hovered protectively. "We'll have you ride in the wagon for a day or two. Give that wound time to heal," Robb said quietly. Theon nodded. He wanted to retort that he could manage on his horse, but pride would not help him recover. "I'll rest if I must," he said. "But we should keep pushing north. If Yara's running, we might corner her before she finds a ship." Robb's gaze was somber. "We will. But for tonight, we gather our wounded, pay respects to the dead, and fortify the position." Under Robb's orders, men built pyres for the fallen Ironborn, whose bodies would otherwise rot among the pines. The Northmen who died were laid out separately, to be carried home if possible, or given a more dignified cremation with families present. Theon watched the flames flicker against the twilight sky, reflecting on how his life had come to this point. Fighting his sister, burning the dead of his father's men. Yet he refused to regret his choice. The Ironborn had chosen conquest. He had chosen a better path. Come dawn, they resumed the march, though at a slower pace to accommodate the wounded. Scouts reported that a handful of Ironborn had slipped away north or tried to circle back to the coast. The bulk of Yara's force was shattered, leaving only isolated reaver bands. That was enough for Robb to declare the region secured. Their next step would be to link with Lord Bolton's column, confirm the entire western coast was cleared, and then proceed back to Winterfell. By the time they rendezvoused with Bolton's men, Theon's wound had begun to heal, though each day of riding left him aching. The news was good. Bolton had triumphed in several skirmishes of his own, pushing back Ironborn from the rills and even capturing a few ships. The results spelled a near-complete rout of Balon's forces on the mainland. Some might linger in hidden coves or caves, but they no longer posed a major threat. Roose Bolton himself arrived in the combined encampment near the banks of a wide, meandering river. A pale man with unsettling eyes, he moved quietly through the ranks, always accompanied by a handful of silent, sallow-faced guards. Theon had never liked the man. Yet Bolton spoke to Robb with perfect politeness, congratulating him on their shared victory. As for Theon, Bolton regarded him with a thin, cool smile. "They speak of your skill at arms, my Lord Greyjoy," he said softly, "and of your loyalty to House Stark. Quite the tale?" Theon inclined his head. "We all serve the king in the north." Bolton's smile did not reach his eyes. "Indeed." Then he drifted away, leaving Theon uneasy. Despite their success, there was an undercurrent of tension whenever Roose Bolton was near, as though the man harbored secret designs. But for now, open conflict was averted. The North had united to drive out the Ironborn. The rest, Theon told himself, was a matter for tomorrow. Within a fortnight, the host began its return to Winterfell. The roads were thick with churned mud, the weather turning damp again. They passed villages that had been ravaged by raids, though some had begun to rebuild. Locals emerged to cheer the king in the north, offering what meager supplies they could spare. By the time they reached Moat Cailin, the triumph over the Ironborn had become a cause for cautious celebration. Theon wondered how long that optimism would last, if the Lannisters launched a renewed assault or if the political climate shifted yet again. But one day at a time was all he could manage. When at last the gray walls of Winterfell rose on the horizon, Theon felt a surge of relief he could scarcely articulate. He recalled the day he had first returned from Pike, carrying Balon's scorn and torn loyalties in his heart. Now he came bearing hard-won victories, recognized by the North as an ally and friend. The gates opened, and Bran, perched on Hodder's shoulders, greeted them with a bright smile. Rickon flanked him, sullen but eager, while the dire wolves prowled excitedly. Lady Catelyn quickly dismounted, hurrying to embrace her younger sons. Robb approached Bran, ruffling the boy's hair. "We've driven the Ironborn from our shores," he told him. "Winterfell is safe." The courtyard erupted in cheers as the soldiers gathered around. Theon slipped from his horse, trying not to wince at the pull in his side. Suddenly, to his surprise, Bran beckoned him closer. "Thank you," the boy said, voice earnest. "We heard about the battles, about how you almost caught Yara." Theon managed a weary smile. "Almost? She's slippery." Bran nodded solemnly. "But you protected her home again, like you promised." A hush seemed to fall, and Theon realized many were watching this exchange. He inclined his head to Bran, then cast a glance at the ancient stone towers. "I just did what needed doing." "We all did." That night, a feast of sorts took place in Winterfell's great hall. Though it was modest, supplies were limited, and the realm still shuddered under the weight of war. Yet they roasted game from the woods, poured wine, and raised toasts to fallen comrades. Robb sat in the high seat, Lady Catelyn beside him, with Bran and Rickon flanking them. Theon was granted a seat at the table of honor, near the lords who had fought beside him. Conversation buzzed with relief, some measure of joy brightening tired faces. A hush fell when Robb stood to speak. He looked out over the hall, his gaze drifting across the gathered men. "We have faced the threat of the Ironborn and driven it from our shores. They may still harry us from the sea, but their hold on the north is broken. I thank you all, lords, knights, soldiers, for your courage. We stand together as a pack, and that is our strength." He lifted his cup, then turned his eyes to Theon. "In particular, I want to honor Theon Greyjoy. Without him, Winterfell might have fallen to the Ironborn at the start of this war. His counsel guided our victories on the stony shore. He has proven, time and again, his loyalty to House Stark. Let all remember that." Theon felt heat rise in his cheeks. It was one thing to be acknowledged quietly, another to be praised in a hall full of men who had once doubted him. He stood, bowing his head. Applause and cheers rippled through the hall, some louder than others, but the sentiment was unmistakable. The people of the north were honoring him. In that moment, Theon recalled the father who had cast him out, the sister who had tried to kill him, and the boy who had once felt trapped between two worlds. Now, he realized he had found his place. Despite the joyful mood, the future remained uncertain. The war with the Lannisters raged on. Balon Greyjoy still held the Iron Islands themselves, and Yara was at large. The realm might fracture further if other claimants rose or alliances crumbled. Yet for one night, Winterfell glowed with a faint echo of its former warmth. Men laughed, shared stories, and found comfort in a fleeting moment of triumph. After the feast, Theon slipped away from the hall, out into the Godwood. The night sky was clear, stars glinting above. The heart tree's face looked calm in the moonlight, red leaves rustling softly. Theon breathed in the scent of damp earth and hot springs. He thought about the arcs of his life. From a hostage boy learning archery with Robb, to a would-be conqueror returning to Pike, to a man who had nearly lost himself in the haze of divided loyalties. Somehow, fate had circled him back to these ancient trees, forging a path through blood and iron. He stepped closer to the weirwood, letting his fingers brush its pale bark. The old gods were said to watch and remember. He didn't know if they truly saw him, if they offered absolution. But he felt a quiet communion under their boughs. Perhaps Ned Stark's spirit lingered here, or maybe that was just wishful fancy. Either way, Theon knew he was done with hesitation. He had chosen his side. A faint rustle behind him made him turn. Robb stood at the edge of the clearing, hands clasped before him. "I thought I might find you here," the young king said softly, stepping closer. "My father often came to the Godwood after feasts to reflect." Theon bowed his head in acknowledgement. "It brings a measure of peace. After all we've done, all we still must do." Robb nodded. Sometimes I think about the cost of this war. My father, my friends, the men who have died. Sansa is a hostage in King's Landing, Arya's missing, and though we've protected the North, we're no closer to ending the Lannister grip. Yet hearing the cheers in that hall tonight, seeing how people look to us for hope, maybe we're doing something that matters. They stood in silence a moment, the Hearttree's carved face seeming to watch with distant wisdom. Then Robb rested a hand on Theon's shoulder, turning him so their eyes met. "Brother," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I don't say it enough. You gave up your birthright, your father, even your sister's regard, to protect us. I know it isn't easy." Theon swallowed, the lump in his throat tight. "They were never truly my family," he murmured. "Not like you. You showed me what it meant to belong. I won't forget that." Robb nodded, then gently pulled Theon into an embrace. Theon stiffened for a heartbeat, unfamiliar with such open affection, but then he relaxed, returning the embrace. It was the closest he'd felt to a true brother in years. They parted and Robb's expression grew more determined. "We'll reclaim my sisters, secure the North, and one day we'll force the Iron Islands to bend the knee or break them if they will not. Then the Lannisters, the Freys, all who stand against us, they'll see the North united, Kraken and Direwolf side by side." Theon nodded, eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. Side by side. They walked back to the castle together, the torches along the ramparts flickering in the darkness, the great hall still echoing with faint music and laughter. Winterfell stood battered yet unbowed as it had for generations. It would endure, Theon thought. And so would he. In the days that followed, life at Winterfell returned to the rhythms of a castle recovering from siege and war. The courtyard bustled with repairs, blacksmiths hammering out new weapons, and stable boys tending weary horses. Soldiers drilled under the watchful eye of Ser Roderick while Maester Luwin oversaw the distribution of supplies for the approaching winter months. Bran studied maps with Lady Catelyn, Rickon tried to manage his unruly wolf, and the occasional laughter of children lent a fragile hope to the air. Theon continued to heal, though the scar from Yara's blade would remain as a permanent reminder of their clash. He refused to stay idle, assisting where he could, surveying the castle walls, advising on Ironborn tactics, even accompanying hunting parties to provide fresh meat. One morning, after an especially successful hunt, Theon found Rickon lurking in the courtyard, restless and bored. The younger Stark boy was all wild energy, his hair unkempt. Shaggy Dog padded at his side, baring teeth at anyone who ventured too close. "Rickon," Theon greeted, handing off the day's catch to a servant. "You look ready to run to the ends of the earth." Rickon scowled. "There's nothing to do. Bran's always in the library or listening to Maester Luwin. Robb won't let me join the war." Theon knelt to ruffle Shaggy Dog's ears, ignoring the wolf's low growl. "You're too young to ride in battle," he said gently. "But you can help here. The kennel master needs help training hounds, or we could teach you more about archery." Rickon kicked at the dirt, pouting. "I want to fight, like you do." Theon rose, placing a hand on Rickon's shoulder. He saw a flash of longing in the boy's eyes, perhaps the fear of being left behind, overshadowed by his older siblings. "Your time will come. For now, the best way to serve is to grow strong. Practice your aim, learn the sword. By the time you're Bran's age, you'll be as fierce as any wolf." Rickon studied Theon skeptically, then gave a small nod. Theon recalled how, when he himself was that age, he'd been as impatient and hot-headed. Perhaps Rickon would find his path without Theon's mistakes. As spring pressed on, the politics of the wider war again intruded. Ravens flew in bearing updates on Lannister movements. Rumors spread that Joffrey still held King's Landing with an iron grip, aided by the Tyrell alliance. Stannis Baratheon brooded on Dragonstone, licking his wounds after the defeat at Blackwater. Lord Tywin Lannister, rumored to be in the field, threatened the Riverlands once more. Robb's hold on the northwestern coast seemed secure, but the question remained, what next? Would he march south again, or focus on fortifying the north until the Lannisters were embroiled in other conflicts? Council after council debated these matters. The Greyjoy clamored for a bold strike at Harrenhal, while Lady Catelyn urged a cautious approach. Roose Bolton, when he arrived for one such meeting, voiced measured support for a joint campaign to retake the Frey strongholds, possibly forging new alliances. Theon listened carefully, wary of Bolton's motives, but found no outright betrayal in his words, merely an unsettling calm. One evening, after such a council ended, Robb and Theon lingered by the fire in Robb's solar. A jug of wine sat between them, half empty. The conversation drifted to personal matters. Robb's gaze flicked to Theon. "If, when we bring Balon Greyjoy to heel, do you think you'll take Pike as your seat?" Theon blinked, startled by the question. "Pike?" "I hadn't given it much thought. My father disowned me, and the Ironborn would never accept me as their lord unless I returned as a conqueror. They worship the drowned god, the old ways of pillage. I'm not one of them anymore. Robb studied him. But it is your birthright by law. And if we do subdue the Iron Islands, installing a loyal Greyjoy might be the best way to keep them in line. It would mean you'd have your own lands to govern under the banner of the king in the north. A vassal lord like the Manderleys or the Glovers. The notion felt surreal. Theon imagined walking those windswept bridges between Pike's towers, ruling over the forbidding isles he had once called home. But could it ever truly be home again? I suppose if you willed it, I'd do my duty, he replied slowly. But I don't know if that would bring any peace. Ironborn are proud. They wouldn't kneel without a fight. And even if they did, they'd rebel the moment I turned my back. Robb shrugged. Then we'll cross that bridge if we come to it. For now, we watch and wait. I have half a mind to focus on the north, secure every corner, then let the south sort itself out. But the memory of my father's death in King's Landing still burns. The Lannisters will never relent unless forced. If we sit idle, they'll eventually come for us again. The fire crackled, shadows dancing on the stone walls. Theon took a swallow of wine, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you. That's certain. Robb's expression softened. I know. Days turned to weeks and the press of war continued. Scouts reported new Lannister forays in the Riverlands, rumors of Tywin's maneuvers near Riverrun. Edmure Tully, Robb's uncle, beseeched aid to defend the Tully seat. The northern lords, weary from fighting Ironborn, debated how many men could be spared. A sense of foreboding settled over Winterfell. Theon felt it keenly. Victory over the Ironborn was one thing, but the Lannisters were a different breed, wealthier, more cunning, with the full resources of the crown at their disposal. Ultimately, Robb concluded that he must support the Riverlands. The promise he had made to his maternal family could not be easily broken, lest the alliance unravel. A large portion of the northern host prepared to march south once more, this time determined to confront the Lannisters. Lady Catelyn traveled with them, determined to stand by her brother's side. Bran would remain in Winterfell, guarded by Ser Roderick. Rickon, too young to travel or fight, stayed behind. Theon once again faced a choice: remain at Winterfell or ride with Robb into the jaws of war. Yet there was no real debate in his mind. He would go where Robb needed him. One crisp morning, the entire castle stirred with the preparations of departure. Horses were saddled, provisions loaded, swords sharpened. Men milled about in fresh leathers or battered mail, each wearing the Stark sigil or that of one of the bannerman houses. Theon stood in the courtyard, checking the straps of his horse's harness. His sight still twinged occasionally, but he was fit to ride. Ser Roderick, a calming presence in his old age, approached. So you ride with Robb again, do you? Theon nodded. He'll need all the help he can get. Roderick regarded him with a mixture of respect and paternal concern. Your decisions have shaped the fate of this castle, Theon. I, for one, am glad to have you among our ranks. A slight smile curved Theon's lips. Thank you, Ser Roderick. Keep Bran safe. Roderick pressed a hand to Theon's shoulder in silent agreement, then moved off to speak with some knights. Moments later, Bran arrived, borne by Hodder. The boy wore a thick cloak, the direwolf sigil pinned at his throat. He looked solemn, as though he already felt the weight of losing his mother and brother once more to the distances of war. Good luck, Bran said softly, his voice carrying in the hush that had fallen over the courtyard. I'll pray to the old gods for your safe return. Theon nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I'll be back before you know it. Then Robb emerged, clad in mail and a heavy fur cloak, gray wind at his side. A hush of reverence rippled through the crowd. He mounted his horse with practiced ease. We ride for the Riverlands. The Lannisters believe they can break our will. They cannot. We are the North. We remember our debts and we keep our word. A roar of approval met his words. Theon mounted as well, positioning himself near Robb at the head of the column. The gates swung open, letting in a crisp, pine-laced breeze. And so they departed Winterfell once again, the drums of war guiding their steps. Theon glanced back only once, catching sight of Bran, Rickon, and Ser Roderick on the ramparts, small figures dwarfed by the castle's gray stone. Then the road turned and Winterfell vanished behind them. During the march south, Theon found himself increasingly at Robb's side, advising on strategy. Though the threat of the Ironborn had receded, the memory of those battles had cemented Theon's standing among the northern lords. Even the great Jon, once so suspicious of Theon's heritage, now clapped him on the back after a hard day's ride, calling him the Kraken pup who fights like a wolf. Theon accepted the strange nickname, sensing the shift in how others viewed him. He had earned a place in the pack. They moved swiftly, passing through Moat Cailin with minimal delay, then crossing into the Neck. Their marshy terrain made for slow going, the bogs and reeds threatening to mire wagons. The crannogmen of House Reed greeted Robb politely but were cautious, mindful of southern intrigues. Beyond the neck lay the rolling plains of the Riverlands, dotted with farmland scarred by Lannister raids. Smoke from distant fires sometimes smudged the horizon, a reminder that the war had never truly abated. At last, they came within reach of the twins, the stronghold of House Frey. Theon had heard talk of Walder Frey's fickle loyalties and how Robb had brokered a marriage pact with one of Frey's daughters to secure passage in the early days of the war. Whether the bond still held weight was a question on many minds. The Freys were notoriously opportunistic. To Theon's relief, their column was allowed across the bridge without incident. Walder Frey's stewards provided grudging hospitality, though the old man himself did not appear, citing illness. Robb conferred with the steward about further alliances, but the atmosphere was tense. Theon's skin crawled with foreboding as he observed the watchful Frey guards. Lady Catelyn, more familiar with Walder Frey's cunning, advised caution. They pressed on, the final leg of the journey bringing them to Riverrun. Edmure Tully and his forces welcomed Robb, though the mood was overshadowed by news of Tywin Lannister's presence somewhere in the region. Camps sprang up around Riverrun's walls as the northern host prepared for battle. Theon could smell the fear and determination in equal measure, the swirl of thousands of soldiers bracing for the next confrontation with the West's mightiest house. Days turned into a flurry of war councils, messenger ravens, and scouting missions. Theon rode with Robb to inspect outposts along the Red Fork, ensuring they were fortified against any Lannister foray. They heard rumors that the Kingslayer, Jaime Lannister, was leading a detachment from Harrenhal, though no one could confirm. The tension stretched every nerve to the breaking point. Eventually, word reached them that Tywin Lannister's main army was on the move, aiming to break the Riverlands' defenses once and for all. Robb read the dispatch with clenched teeth, then summoned his bannermen to the Riverrun Great Hall. Theon stood among the crowd, listening intently. Robb outlined the plan. They would meet Tywin in open battle near the fords of the Red Fork, using the terrain to slow the enemy's heavy cavalry. If the Northmen could hold firm, reinforcements from the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, might flank the Lannisters, forcing them into retreat. Night fell on the eve of battle. Theon found himself standing atop Riverrun's walls, gazing down at the torches glowing in the sprawling camp. He knew, from bitter experience, that tomorrow's sunrise would bring blood and death. He remembered the men he'd cut down on the beaches and in the pine forests, the reek of carnage. Yet he was not afraid. He had chosen this path and would walk it to the end. Robb joined him, both of them silent for a time. Then Robb said, "If we succeed tomorrow, Tywin may be forced to withdraw or negotiate. But if we fail," Theon laid a hand on the hilt of his sword, "we won't fail. We have too much to fight for." Robb nodded, the torchlight flickering across his face. "Tomorrow, then," he murmured, "we'll end this, or at least come closer to the end." They parted, each to find what rest they could. Dawn came all too soon, the sky streaked with red, as though foreshadowing the day's bloodshed. The combined Stark and Tully forces moved out, crossing farmland turned to churned mud by horse hooves. Theon rode near Robb's personal guard, scanning the horizon for any glint of Lannister steel. By mid-morning, they saw dust clouds rising beyond a gentle ridge, heralding the approach of Tywin's host. Theon's pulse quickened. The men formed ranks, archers at the rear, cavalry on the flanks. Robb, astride a magnificent warhorse, lifted his sword in silent command. Then came the pounding of hooves as the first Lannister wave crested the ridge. Bright banners emblazoned with the golden lion, armor gleaming. They advanced with chilling discipline. Theon drew his sword. The horns of the north blared across the fields. Grey wind, a gray blur of muscle and fang, bounded at Robb's side. The clash began with a thunderous roar. Arrows raining from the sky, knights colliding in a storm of steel, men shouting war cries. Theon urged his horse forward, meeting a Lannister man-at-arms head-on. Their swords crashed. Theon's breath came in gasps, adrenaline surging. Another foe galloped at him, mace raised. Theon pivoted his mount, parried, then slashed across the man's exposed neck. Blood spattered on the ground. He lost sight of Robb in the melee. Everywhere was chaos, Shouting, smoke, the ring of blades on shields. Theon pressed deeper into the fray, trusting the northern spears around him to keep his flanks secure. He saw men bearing the Karstark sigil fall beneath Lannister cavalry. Great Jon Umber leading a ferocious charge with his booming war cry. The battlefield became a blur of mud, gore, and confusion. Time lost meaning. Theon fought on, sword arm aching, the tang of blood sharp in his nostrils. A Lannister knight with a crimson plume lunged at him, nearly unseating him. Theon clung to the saddle, swung his sword in a desperate arc that bit into the knight's shoulder. The man howled, toppling from his horse. Theon reined around, searching for more threats. A fresh wave of Lannister infantry poured across the ford, aiming to flank the Stark line. Theon cursed, kicking his horse forward, rallying a handful of Northmen to hold them off. They met in a vicious scrum, shields splintering. Theon's arms burned, each swing a test of endurance. He felt a spear glance off his mail, bruising his ribs. The sky seemed to darken under the pall of dust and rising smoke. Suddenly, a horn blast sounded from the flank, where the Blackfish had been expected. Through a gap in the fray, Theon glimpsed a column of riders bearing the Tully Trout banner, charging hard into the Lannister side. Tywin's men wavered, pinned between two forces. A ragged cheer rose from the Northmen. With renewed vigor, they surged forward. The tide began to turn. The Lannister line buckled, men staggering back. Some tried to retreat across the ford, others held ground in desperation. Theon pressed on, ignoring the cramp in his side, the sting of sweat in his eyes. He saw one last knot of resistance, for men with the lion sigil, determined to fight to the death. He circled them, coordinating with a pair of Karstark knights. Their swords flashed, cutting down the Lannisters one by one. At last, the field was theirs. Bodies sprawled in heaps, the water of the river running red. The surviving Lannister forces fled or knelt to surrender. Stark banners whipped in the wind. Theon reined in his horse, heart hammering, surveying the devastation. Another victory, but at what cost? Already he heard the groans of the wounded, the keening of men calling for lost comrades. He dismounted, nearly stumbling from exhaustion. As he walked, he saw Robb astride his warhorse, battered but uninjured, gray wind panting at his side. Their eyes met. Robb raised his sword in silent salute. Theon raised his own, then let it fall to his side, blood dripping from the blade. They had triumphed once more, forging a legend of the king in the north and his loyal lords. Yet as Theon sank to his knees beside a dying Karstark man, pressing a hand to the warrior's chest in a futile attempt to stanch the bleeding, he felt the old hollowness return. War was not glory. War was loss and pain. But he would see it through for Robb, for Winterfell, for the north. In the aftermath, amid the swirl of medics and battlefield looters, Theon found himself recalling the path he'd taken to reach this moment. He had chosen loyalty over betrayal, gained a family he never expected, fought battles on coastlines and now in open fields. Ned Stark's words echoed in his memory, "When you choose loyalty, choose it fully." He had done so, and he would never look back. Steeling himself, Theon Greyjoy rose, wiping sweat and blood from his brow, and strode forward to stand beside his king. They had a war to finish, and by the old gods, he would not rest until the North stood victorious.